the London Assembly Economy Committee, and I think we better start because I think we're about a minute late. And thank you very much to Susan for her assistance earlier. I'd like to start with some remarks from me as the chair. My name is Leonie Cooper and I'm the London Assembly for Merton Wandsworth, but I'm also the chair of today's meeting and the chair generally of the Economy Committee. I'd like to welcome all of our guests for coming along. We'll come to you in a minute. And can I also welcome members of the public who are either here or are watching on the webcast. Today's meeting has got some sort of ordinary items of business, but the main item on the agenda will be focus on low-paid work and also in-work poverty in London. And if anyone wants to join in on social media, please use the hashtag Assembly Economy. So we're going to go through the formal items of business first. And if I could just ask everyone, unless you really want the world to know about your most fabulous ringtone, if you could, I'm not saying necessarily turn them off, but if you could put all your devices onto silent so that we don't enjoy any ringtones or bleeping noises. We've had apologies for absence this morning from Sean Bailey. I don't think there's a substitute because I think that was at the last minute. And hopefully you can see everyone else's nameplates for the other members of the committee. And first of all, if we look at the declarations of interest in the agenda, which is on pages 1 to 4, has anyone got any further declarations of interest in the committee?
Can I declare that I'm a trustee of Trust for London, appointed by the Assembly, and also a member of the GMB?
Thank you.
I'm also a member of the GMB.
And I'm also a member of Unite, and also the GMB. Yes, I haven't turned my phone. I like my ringtone. You won't be hearing any more of it, but I haven't actually put my phones on silent yet, unfortunately. Yes, I'm also a member of the GMB. Any further declarations of interest in Trust for London or trade unions or anything else? Okay. Can I ask members of the committee to note the other appointments which are included in pages 1 to 4?
Noted.
Okay, we then have item number 3, which is membership of the committee, and the committee are recommended to note the membership. We also have the terms of reference at item 4 and standing delegation arrangements at item 5. Is everyone happy to note all of those? Okay, we also have the minutes of the previous meeting at item 6 and can be found on pages 5 to 38. Is everyone happy to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting on the 3rd of April?
Agreed.
Okay. And we also have the summary list of actions, which is on pages 39 to 44. Is everyone happy to note the completed and also the outstanding actions from previous meetings?
Yeah.
And can we also at this point note thanks to Susan Hall, who's been chaired the last meeting and has also been chairing the committee over the course of the last year. So moving on to the substantive item, which is on low-paid work and in-work poverty. And I'd like to start by welcoming our guests, and I'm going to start on the left. And then gradually move to the right, and that says nothing at all about your politics, just where you're geographically located in the room. And so the first guest that I would like to welcome is Sam Gurney, who I want to say is from Surtuck, but obviously that just means I'm very old-fashioned, and you're now from the Leasy?
So I get it wrong as well. London, Teessy, London, east and southeast of England, which just about fits on a business card now. Anyone who knows my predecessor will know, but she still very much calls it Surtuck.
And you are the Regional Secretary. Thank you very much for coming, Sam. We've also got Manny, who is the Director of Policy from the Trust for London. Thank you very much for being here. We've also got Amy Hulme, who is the Senior Programme Manager from the Living Wage Foundation. Thank you very much for coming along. Tim Butcher, who is the Chief Economist from the Low Pay Commission. Thank you very much for being with us. And then finally also Helen O'Connor, who is from the GMB and has some specific experience relating to working on low-paid situations. And obviously we'll look forward to putting various different questions to all of you. We're going to start with me. And my first question, actually, I'm going to pick on Manny to begin with, if you don't mind. And that is, how much does low pay... sorry, we're going to have a presentation from Central London first of all? Right, you're going to do a presentation and I'm going to be quiet.
Okay, I'll give you a brief overview of some of the data around low pay in London. Much of this covers what was in the very good briefing, but it just sets out a narrative for you. So just as an overview, the story of low pay in London is, since the mid-1990s, there's been a growth in work poverty. So it's no longer about worklessness and poverty being the sort of atypical situation for people who don't have much money. It's about being in work and not having enough to make ends meet. There's also been a well-documented stalling in household incomes over the past 15 years. Combining that with inflation, pay has been squeezed, so people can buy less with their money. There's been a post-crash increase in low-paid work and a concentration of low-paid jobs in certain sectors and places in London. And that's been seen with, alongside that has been an increase in involuntary part-time working, so people not working as many hours as they want to, and also temporary working, well documented with the rise in the gig economy. And as often is the case in these sorts of circumstances, there's been a disproportionate effect on certain groups, some minorities, women and disabled people. But starting off with the increase of in-work poverty, here sort of the two the bars with the big red lines on shows just the increase in the number of households, which adults and children in households which are experiencing in-work poverty. It's been a massive leap. There's been lots of things driving that. There's been some societal changes, macroeconomic changes, political stuff around the welfare state and social security, and just it's been a very, very, very turbulent period of time. One of the interesting things to note here is that the decrease in children in workless families has been sort of mirrored with an increase in children in sort of working poor families. So the two things have sort of balanced each other out in that respect. There's also been a decrease in pensioner poverty, which is worth noting because it shows what can happen when the state does use the system of social security to maintain a decent income for citizens. The documented, well-documented stalling of household incomes, this data comes from the Resolution Foundation report on living standards in London called London Stalling, and it shows that sort of real pay at the moment is no better than it was 15 years ago for people across, I think this is London, and also there's been a sort of inflection point where sort of median household incomes are sort of matched, or for a short period of time were less than pensioner household incomes, which is sort of counter to what has traditionally been the case. It has disproportionately affected, again, some people, so the pay gap has been across the sort of income spectrum, but it has affected women more strongly than some men. And what that means is 1 in 5 Londoners is paid less than a living wage, which is what we would sort of deem as is required to live a sort of a decent, a basic standard of living. It's about 22.5% of households at the moment. You can see an increase since, again, the 2008, with a sort of slightly bigger increase from 2011 onwards. The industries that these jobs are concentrated on are sort of hotels, restaurants, retail and leisure. You can see, particularly in the hotel and restaurant world, that a large proportion of jobs, over 60%, are low paid less than the living wage, and over 40% for those in retail. So significant amounts of people working in those sectors aren't paid enough to get by. Again, the gig economy has got lots of attention. There's been London has the highest number of self-employed people in the UK. The thing that's quite interesting to note here is, even though the transport bar is quite short, I think since 2007 there's been a sort of 86% increase in people working, self-employed workers in the transport industry, and that's been the thing that captures imagination. Delivery drivers, Uber drivers, Hermes and so forth. There's also been an increase in involuntary part-time working. So the recession has seen people who not be out of work, they've been in work, but they haven't been able to find the amount of hours that they want. That work is often precarious, it's obviously low paid and inflexible. Most of these residents, unsurprisingly, on low incomes are living in outer London. It's a factor of the housing market, the reduction of social housing in London, and people moving out to where it was affordable, but it's again increasingly becoming unaffordable in outer London boroughs. And the same goes for the location of low-paid jobs. So the majority of, in outer London boroughs, high proportions of low-paid jobs in the London boroughs. There has been an increase for both men and women of low-paid work, but the increase has been larger for women across both part-time and full-time working. And some ethnic groups are disproportionately impacted. So you can look at this in two ways. You can look at the blue bar, which is as a proportion of that group, or you can look at it as the orange bar, which is an absolute number. It tells you two stories. So in absolute numbers, white, British and other whites are still absolutely in a high number of low-paid work. As a proportion of the population, it disproportionately impacts on Pakistani, Bangladeshi people in other ethnic groups, and African and Caribbean and Black British. Disabled people are more likely to be low paid. I think it's 27% for non-disabled, 37% for disabled, so again across the board with regards to educational levels. And whilst we're looking at incomes, it's also important to look at the cost of living, the expenditure. And we know that transport, housing, childcare costs more in London, but this is from the Resolution Foundation report on living standards. Other things cost more in London too. So alcohol, tobacco, stuff to furnish your house. If you want to go out, if you want to go to restaurants, if you want to engage in leisure activities, it costs more in London than it does in other parts of the country. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing to tackle some of these problems. So we have a whole strand of work, and we will do for the next 5 years, on tackling low-paid, insecure work. A number of initiatives. Step Up is looking at how you can help people in low-paid work progress to better-paid work, funding several organisations to try and support those individuals. What we've learned is, individual personalised support, work coaches, stuff that's tailored around the person and their needs is more likely to have a success. But unfortunately, we did a control group study, so we put the people who we were supporting against a control group who weren't being supported, and the study showed that there were no statistically different outcomes across those groups. So actually, the sort of number of people who progressed was kind of the same for both of those. The Better Work Network, which brings together lots of the people in the city who are working on improving the situation around in-work poverty and low-paid and secure work. That includes Joseph Rowntree, Learning and Work Institute, Living Wage Foundation and others. Funding the Time-Wise Innovation Unit to try and find work with employers to find new ways of providing good quality part-time flexible working. We fund lots of advice services around employment across the city, including stuff around unpaid wages, which is a big problem for people on low incomes, providing sort of lawyer support to help caseworkers casework and get people through tribunals. And we fund lots of collective action. So New Economics Foundation are bringing together unions and communities. Unions 1021 are bringing the co-worker platform from America, which allows employers to start campaigns to improve workplace conditions. And the Independent Workers of Great Britain to provide legal advice to lots of people working in the gig economy. But we're also doing stuff on the cost of living side. So working with Citizens UK to campaign for better quality, more affordable housing. We've funded research that hasn't been published yet with the Centre of London on creating a more equitable transport system, so people on low incomes, wherever they are, can achieve similar outcomes to those on better incomes through the transport system. And we've invested in Fair by Design, which is led by Barrack Cadbury Trust, which is a social investment fund which supports social businesses that are trying to tackle the poverty premium, so trying to ensure that people on low incomes don't pay more for utilities, that they don't pay more for access to credit and so forth. And also on childcare. So we're about to publish some research by the Family and Childcare Trust, which shows the provision of school-aged childcare and where there are gaps, and sort of correlate gaps with areas of low income. And we're also funding New Economics Foundation, who are setting up a parent-led childcare cooperative in New Cross, which we think could play a bit of a role in tackling this problem. That's it.
Well, that covers an awful lot of ground.
Yes.
Can I just see if that sparked any questions amongst other members of the committee that you would like to just pose very quickly to Manny now on specific aspects of the presentation? And the same question to our guests. Has anyone got anything that they would like to quickly pick up with Manny from the presentation? I'm sure a lot of it's going to come up again during the rest of the morning. Okay, if not, then I am going to move on to our questions. Thank you very much for that, Manny. I think that's been a really good way into the discussion both of low pay and also in-work poverty. How much does low pay affect levels of poverty?
How much does it affect levels of poverty?
Yes.
So about 2/3 of a household income is for people in in-work poverty is from earned income, from a job. About a third is from the system of social security. So it has a significant impact. I mean, you can talk about, I'm sure we'll talk about welfare and social security, but if you're on low pay, 2/3 of it is all the income you're getting. If that pay isn't at all correlated with the cost of living in London, like the living wages, then it doesn't. Housing costs, transport costs, childcare costs are unaffordable.
Yes. One of the shocking things that I've become aware of is the growth of the people who are working, who've been using food banks, which is so surprising. But a lot of the things that came out of your presentation seem to be sort of hinting that is a huge issue in voluntary, part-time and so on and so forth. But why do you think the proportion of low pay varies so much by sector and industry?
I'll pass on to others in a second, but I mean, it's business models essentially and margins, isn't it? These businesses are choosing to pay low wages because that's how they operate their businesses. There are thousands of businesses that have come through living wage nation that are choosing a different way, and they believe there's a different business model and a different business case for them to make. And what I think is most interesting about living wage, so I'm talking about living wage and there's someone who can talk better about it, is that it grew during a time of recession. It grew during a time where businesses are being squeezed, where retail, hospitality were being squeezed, but those businesses were choosing to pay their workers a living wage because they felt like there was a business case for it, essentially.
So what do these variations mean for how we tackle low pay in London? And I want to come to you on that, Sam, I think.
Just to build on what Manny was saying there, because I think when you look at the sectors in particular, there's a fairly direct correlation there between sectors which, as you say, have partly got business practices which absolutely are predicated on driving down pay and other conditions, and sectors which are the sectors which have the lowest union densities. So I mean, if we look at kind of hospitality and catering in London, if we look at retail, despite big strides by some of the unions in retail, social care, where obviously in the public sector you've got quite strong unionisation rates, but in private sector social care we are much weaker. And you can see a correlation, I think, if you look at kind of figures internationally as well, of where you've seen a fall in collective bargaining coverage, so sectors have never had it or it's been reduced, and sectors which have got poor terms and conditions. There is just an absolute direct correlation there. So obviously one of our key kind of contentions, you would expect me to say this, expect my GMB colleagues will come in, is one of the key things is how do you rebuild workers' ability to actually build on the base which we've got, which is national minimum wage and the London living wage, which is incredibly important. There's a baseline. As we know, we've got 700,000 workers in London who are below the London living wage itself. But even after that, you want to kind of be building on that to get a fair rate for a job. And we've got huge swathes of our economy in London which are predicated on poor terms and conditions, and that's what we need to be challenging and where we need to see work from the Assembly and the Mayor to actually kind of work with us and all of the organisations who are here to help challenge that.
Can I just bring you in here, Helen? Because we were talking there about the rise of the gig economy, but there's also been a rise in outsourcing as well. And
exactly what I want to talk about as part of my, when I want to talk about outsourcing, the impact it's having on pay in the public sector specifically, and what we're trying to do to basically challenge some of that as GMB. Yeah.
So it's not just in the gig economy, it's also potentially quite rife in outsourced areas. And does that sit alongside a lower level of union membership that Sam was just referring to?
Yes, it does. Yeah, if we'd higher density, we'd be more effective in challenging it at the moment. But workers are joining in the hospital. I organise specifically in South London hospitals amongst caterers, cleaners and porters, and they are joining and they are going on demonstrations across the hospitals. We're building all the time, and we have to challenge it because people are literally doing 2 jobs to survive. They're going to food banks, like you say. I'll talk about that a bit more in a bit, but it's pretty dire for people.
So do you think we're seeing a change in the places where poverty is rife in London, or do you think it is present everywhere, but there are sort of, if you like, denser spots? I mean, that seemed to really be what, thank you for that, what you were saying, Manny.
So there's been a narrowing of the gap between, traditionally, 20, 30 years ago, poverty was seen as an inner London thing, outer London was seen as the more affluent sort of suburbs. There's been a narrowing of that gap, and actually it's sort of becoming much closer. So poverty is mirrored between inner and outer London, and a lot of that is a function of that is the housing market. So what we can't say for certain is that it's people who are being forced out of inner London to outer London. It could be people who are living in inner London but rents have gone up and they're being pushed into poverty because of that.
Right. And which Londoners would you say are most affected by in-work poverty, and what are the reasons for that? And I'll start with you, Manny, and then I'll just bring anyone else who would like to comment on that.
That we've seen, just for some of the data, there's a disproportionate effect on some groups. So Pakistani, Bangladeshi communities, some Black Afro-Caribbean communities, Black British, also disabled people are disproportionately affected, and some impact on women as well. And then there's the sectoral analysis, so people working in those sectors, often who, London's sort of labour force has increased largely through migration in the last sort of, I think 5 to 10 years or so. People coming into the city to work in those industries being paid less.
Do you want to add anything to
It
that?
was just, so a couple of points. One would be on kind of where, and just to really kind of reinforce Manny's point there, that what we've seen is that spread across the whole of London. So the statistics, and we look very heavily at Trust for London stats as well as GLA stats, but we obviously do our own research as well. We had a story last year where we did a breakdown of all 32 boroughs and the city, which showed that across 31 of those 33 boroughs we've seen a real terms pay fall since 2008. So Manny referred to that, and it's much starker in London than anywhere else in the country, where it has happened everywhere. But the really interesting thing was that was across everything. I said with 2 exceptions. I'm still trying to work out why Sutton was one of the exceptions, but with 2 exceptions, which are Southwark and Merton, were the exceptions. We've seen that real terms pay fall across the whole piece. And yes, people are being moved out, as we know, of inner London to other boroughs, but actually the figures in your presentation there that show all of the boroughs, this is just, this is serious kind of, bits across every single bit of our capital. So there is no kind of, it's geographically spread. I'll just take the opportunity very quickly on the outsourcing point, and I know Helen's going to come back to this, but just 2 examples there of where we're seeing kind of workers who were previously in fairly kind of good quality paying jobs, which were admittedly outsourced, but where now you've got companies who are driving it down. We've got a dispute hilariously at Bays, the government ministry responsible for these standards, where their outsourced staff, cleaners, caterers, security, post room, are not being paid London Living Wage. And that's the government department responsible for these terms and conditions, and they've been on 6 days of strike action already. And on May Day we had the different company, but at the Foreign Office, where again staff who previously have been on fairly decent terms and conditions, but have now all of the support staff functions at the Foreign Office have had that taken away and are now on strike. So you're seeing this across swathes of the private sector, but also spreading into the public sector as well, as a direct result of outsourcing and a direct result of business practices of some of those companies.
Yes, I do feel that we talked a lot about the gig economy, and I think we know about the situation there. I personally don't feel that we're sufficiently talking about outsourced jobs and roles, and then them, being on very poor terms and conditions. I don't know whether anyone else wanted to comment on my question about the Londoners that are most affected and the reasons for this.
In our experience, it's primarily migrant workers again, African, Asian, across the hospital sites that I work in, a lot of women as well.
I just wanted to add to that. If you're working part-time, you're 3 times more likely to be paid less than the living wage, so part-time work. And if you're young as well, so if you're 18 to 21, you are nearly 70% more likely to be paid less than the living wage too. So along with if you are from a BAME background or if you're a woman, there are other areas that are most affected by sort of low pay in London.
Again, so TUC research would back all of that up in terms of disproportionate impact on BME communities, migrant workers from various backgrounds, but also women, and we've referred already to things like additional transport and childcare and other caring costs, and it does still fall disproportionately on those groups. So you've got other factors as well as the basic low pay, which is impacting more on those groups, and it's very clear from the statistics.
And do you think the introduction of the national living wage has made an impact on low paid work, and does it go far enough to help those in poverty, or are we differentiating here maybe between the impact elsewhere in the country and the impact in London, which is my concern? I think I can see a lot of nodding actually. Can I start at this end and then work along and say...
I mean, clearly, as we know, because of the disproportionate living costs in London, where we are very pleased with the national living wage, national minimum wage, living wages has gone up, and we are calling for higher increases in that. It just doesn't impact as much in London because of the additional costs that our people have. Hence the importance of a London living wage as a baseline for us, and I said very much as a baseline, but so yes, we welcome the increases and they are important, but you've got issues around enforcement and the lack of it. We just had our story out 2 weeks ago, looking at the figures on enforcement of minimum wage and the huge gaps that we've still got there. But it just isn't. It's not possible to live on that in London in any meaningful way.
No. Amy?
It's a welcome pay rise for lots of low-paid workers, and millions of people had a pay rise every time the minimum wage increases. But there is a gap between the minimum wage and what you actually need to earn to be able to live. And in London, that looks at about £4,500 a year annually if you were working full-time. It's not a small amount of money for people on low pay. And the biggest pressures on the London rate that make it more than the UK rate are housing, childcare and transport. That's why we have a higher rate in London, because those pressures push up the rate there. The national minimum wage is increasing, and it's welcome that it is, but it does only apply to if you're over 25 and above, which links to my previous point that young people are paid a lot less, and they still have the same cost of living as if you were 25 predominantly. So I think there is definitely more to be done.
Yeah. So the national living wage was introduced in 2015. It caused an immediate increase of 50 pence per hour for those aged 25 and over. Prior to that, the national minimum wage had increased since it was introduced in 1999. It had increased faster than both average earnings, and throughout the recession it increased at a higher rate than average earnings, such that it went from being about 46% of median earnings in 1999 when it was introduced to around 52.5% of average earnings in 2015, prior to the introduction of the national living wage. It is now 59% of median earnings. So there's been some huge increases in the national living wage at the same time as when average earnings have not increased. So average earnings are still 6% below what they were in 2008. Right? The national minimum wage, national living wage, is substantially higher than what it was in 2008 in real terms. So there's been a squeezing of the earnings distribution. So just to say that when the national minimum wage was introduced back in 1999, there was two concerns raised about its introduction. One was that it would lead to job loss.
I thought it was going to lead to the end of the world. There were several people who said that it was going to be, absolutely, the world was going to collapse.
With quotes of sort of 2 million job losses. The other was it was going to lead to a wage price spiral that reflected what had happened in the 1970s. Neither of those things came to pass. So there's very little evidence of job loss, some squeezing of differentials, but very limited evidence of any spillover effects. So knock-ons further up the wage distribution. Where the evidence on the sort of what the minimum wage did, it seems to have had a reduction in, so it substantially increased the wages of the lowest paid, both in hourly terms and in weekly terms, although there has been some reductions in hours for minimum wage workers. There has been a squeeze in profits, although in part that's the intention to transfer some money from employers to workers. There's been some evidence of pass on in prices in those non-tradable sectors. So when I mean non-tradable, it's sort of internationally non-tradable. So where prices haven't been able to be passed on, there's a lot of manufacturing and agricultural products where it's more difficult to, you've got a world price, so it's more difficult to pass on. But in sort of consumer industries, bars, hospitality, restaurants, etc., it's easier to add 5 pence to a dish. So we have seen some evidence of that. And there's been some positive correlation with productivity, although very limited impacts on training. But we have found changes in pay structures and reductions sort of in hierarchies and pay zones. So, for example, if you take the supermarket sector, there used to be a separate rates for trolley collector, shelf stacking and cashier. Over time, those sort of three pay rates have merged into but in terms of reducing those hierarchies, it's also led to some concern about progression and how people then move on up the ladder if those rungs in the ladder are removed. And it's a sort of dilemma that the Low Pay Commission sort of has to balance in terms of increases in the minimum wage against the impacts on it. And we've also seen reductions in non-wage benefits. So less generous sort of staff discounts or in terms of supplementing meals at work and various things.
Gosh, you almost mentioned luncheon vouchers. But yes, so that's very interesting because it sounds as though it's sort of squeezed up from the bottom, but it hasn't created the spiral up at the top, and there's actually then been a delayering of different roles and bring those together, so there's more of a squeeze in the middle. So I just squeeze middle, to coin a phrase again. How good is it being able to identify in work poverty if you're looking at people and saying they're earning below the London living wage? Is that a good indicator point, or are we still seeing people suffering in work poverty who are earning the London living wage and are therefore above it? So is that a sort of point at which we need to focus, or do you find people who are earning the London living wage who are suffering from in work poverty? And I'm going to start with you, Manny.
There are lots of different ways. So there's the households below average income measure, which is the one that's used for poverty, and then there's the living wage measure, which works what we would class as below low pay. But there's also something else called the minimum income standard, which is also research we fund through Loughborough University. And the minimum income standard essentially takes a bunch of members of the public, puts them in a room and says, what's the minimum, what do people need to live a minimum acceptable standard of living in this city. It was also done across the UK. And they'll sort of talk through every aspect of a household's life and then look at different types of household composition. And then the researchers will go off and cost up everything in a very, very detailed budget in a spreadsheet and say, this is how much it costs to live what the public think is a minimum acceptable standard of living. And in London, 4 in 10 don't meet what the public would generally think as the minimum standard of living. Your benefits cover, if you got a full 23,000, it covers I think half of it or a quarter of it, depending on your household composition. It's just not enough. So there are lots of different ways of looking at things. Living wage, I think it's attached to cost of living. It can get you right at the bottom. If you spoke to members of the public, it's higher than that.
Just to add to that, actually, the minimum income standards that is produced by Loughborough University underpins the living wage rates. So it is sort of central to both the UK living wage and the London living wage rate. So we use that social consensus of what a decent, it's not aspirational, it is, above the poverty level, what you need to be able to earn to have that decent standard of living. And we do think that it should be it's the minimum that you should pay your staff. And our role in this has always been to encourage employers to voluntarily pay that rate as a minimum. And we've seen 5,000 businesses across the UK, large and small, pay that rate to their staff, but also, importantly, thinking about subcontracted and outsourced staff to their third-party staff as well when they're providing you with labour. So it covers where the low pay is and where we know low pay is when you outsource.
So would you say that the minimum income standard is a better place to be looking? And I just want to be absolutely clear, it doesn't include the aspirational holiday to Mauritius, the Maldives or any other tropical island beginning with any other letter of the alphabet. It is an actual set of things that are more basic than that. So that would be a better place for us to be looking, because I was very interested in what Tim was saying about people who are above the living wage, but perhaps their salaries have been stagnating, whereas the living wage or has been coming up. But
I think pay is one part of the puzzle. and it's not the only part, and the number of hours a person works is important. How secure their job is also important. The impact of universal credit and welfare changes, that all of those things make up, you know, the impact of low pay in the UK. And I think it's when I talk to businesses, I say to them, you shouldn't really look at just pay on its own. You should be looking at how many hours you're offering your staff and whether that is consistent, and whether your staff are underemployed and you can offer more, and what training you're offering them so they don't stay at that low pay level for 10 years or more. I think there was a Resolution Foundation report that said that 4 in 10 was still in low pay after 10 years, and that there are different parts to this conversation.
So do you think there's any data that we're missing that would help us identify or understand which households are at risk of in-work poverty more clearly? Or have we just got the data but it's all in different formats or different places?
We have lots of data, and so I mean, we've all come prepared with armies of fact sheets for you, because we could reel it off. So there is something coming out for London, which is being developed by an agency called Policy and Practice, which are very deeply involved with local authorities and supporting them on welfare reform. And they'll have a dashboard. I think it's actually live now. I can send a link afterwards, which can show you borough by borough how many people are facing a cash shortfall at the moment, how many people are likely to be facing a cash shortfall. Some of that's using a lot of that's using the data local authorities have, doing some analytics work on it and projecting forward. So it's quite clever, but it doesn't have data for all of the boroughs out there. So I mean, it might be others might think, but I think there's lots of data. It's the solution, which is the hard part. Yeah.
I think
Okay, so it's bringing it together in one place that makes it more meaningful. Well, I have to say, the headline of saying a borough, I still think I don't like the expression, but the LSOAs, the lowest super output areas, is probably more accurate, because I think Wandsworth is, next to Richmond in terms of per capita income, so that looks like everything's really happy in Wandsworth. That's because lots of people in Putney are paid huge amounts of money, come to Tooting, where Pakistani and Bangladeshi taxi drivers in the gig economy live in greater numbers. Very different story. Yeah. So I think the headline around the boroughs is possibly slightly misleading.
Policy Practice does allow you to go down to boroughs.
It does. Okay.
Sorry, wards.
Yes, down to wards. Okay, that would be much better. Tim, sorry, I interrupted.
So I just wanted to reiterate what Manny said. It's really important to distinguish between weekly and hourly earnings. So when people talk about minimum sort of living income, they normally think of it in weekly or monthly terms. We set a national minimum wage purely in hourly terms. The national living wage is a misnomer. It's a higher national minimum wage because it's set with the labour market, productivity and affordability of businesses in mind. It's not set with any consideration of the ability of workers to meet their needs. If you look at the hourly paid, most of the hourly paid who are minimum wage workers, when you look at weekly pay, they're not right at the bottom of the weekly pay distribution. Combines lots and lots of different types of workers. Many are on much higher rates of pay than the minimum wage, well above the London living wage or the UK living wage, but it depends on how many hours you work. Even if you get paid £100 an hour, unless you get sufficient numbers of hours a week, you're not going to be able to live.
So the involuntary part-time is a very important issue.
Yeah, so sort of, if thinking back about poverty sort of 20, 30 years ago, the groups that were most likely to be in poverty were pensioners and workless households, much less likely if you were in work. With the triple lock, pensioners have been to some extent protected over the last 20 odd years. The number of workless households has fallen quite dramatically across the whole of the UK. But we've seen a big increase in work poverty. And it depends on how many hours that the household is working. It depends on household circumstances, family circumstances. And we know that one of the big drivers of poverty is housing, childcare and transport, which setting a sort of an hourly rate doesn't really take into account, because going down the sort of living wage, if you had an hourly rate for a living wage, you'd then be sort of perhaps even going down the route of saying that people who were married and had children should get paid more than single people, or more than, in order for that to be reflected in what they need to live. So we've always argued at the Low Pay Commission that, or the government when it was introduced, argued that the minimum wage was part of a strategy to make work pay. And part of that strategy was to introduce a floor below which wages couldn't fall. But then for those in need, based on their household or family circumstances, was topped up by in-work benefits, tax credits, working tax credits, child benefits, etc., and disability benefits. And that's how you then got those households above any poverty line.
With the 2/3 around the pay and the 1/3 around the additional benefits. So what about any other, this is my final question before we move on to some of my colleagues who I'm sure are champing at the bit now to come in with some questions. Are there any other aspects of what you're being paid that impact on low pay? For example, access to and length of sickness pay, access to flexible working, pension schemes, holiday pay, that should also be included into this discussion about how we understand how pay or lack of pay contributes to in-work poverty. I can see Helen nodding. Did you want to come in?
Yes, we have an issue with outsourced workers. They're outsourced to a private company called ISS, and they generally tend to be hospital cleaners, caterers, porters and security staff. What they do is they don't pay sick pay from day one if somebody is directly employed on their contract. So we've got a two-tier workforce. So we've got some workers on an NHS terms and conditions. They get sick pay from day one. They're okay. But if you're directly employed, you're coming into the hospital as a new porter, you will not get sick pay from day one. Some of these private providers don't even have a sick pay scheme at all, and people have to rely on statutory sick pay, which is, I think it's between £92 and £118 a week. I mean, you certainly wouldn't pay rent on that. We had a case of a worker in Kingston Hospital who had a stroke last year. He was off work for 6 months. And he received statutory sick pay. That was all he got, and his colleagues actually had to have a whip round for him because he wouldn't be able to survive. You know, he had a stroke, it wasn't his own fault. The company did nothing, you know, so it was an appalling lack of duty of care to that employee. We've also come across people, you know, having cancer treatment, you know, and again, they're being harassed with letters calling them to disciplinary meetings, and the employers know that they're, you know, they've got a serious illness. Again, they're getting no sick pay. Some companies have an accrual scheme, so if you're in work, if you put in one full month of work, then you'll accrue 1 sick day, 2 months, 2 sick days, but you still have a 3-day wait to get sick pay should you fall ill. And our argument to them is, well, you know, it's not good for the business, because if I had 12 sick days and I had to wait 3 days to get sick pay, I'd probably take another extra few days to get the pay. You know, it's a disincentive, isn't it, for people to come into work. And the other thing it does is it forces these workers, I mean, they're so low paid, they cannot afford to have an unpaid day, and basically it causes them to go into the hospital when they're ill themselves, they're in a hospital environment. You know, it's a cross-infection risk to the public, and we're so concerned about this happening up and down the hospitals in the country that we've taken this to government ministers who've agreed to look into it, because they don't even realise what's going on. We've taken it to the hospital trusts in Kingston particularly. We've sat down with them, we've explained our concerns, and to the company. There's lots of sick pay schemes they could implement that wouldn't break the bank, but they do not want to pay sick pay from day one, any of them, and it's a real concern for us in GMB.
Okay, there's something really crazy about the idea of running a hospital and then having people who are coming in to clean it who are so ill that they're then going to spread germs around the rest of the hospital and make people who are there, who are probably physically vulnerable anyway, more ill whilst they are performing cleaning duties. But I'm going to try...
serving meals as well.
And serving meals. I'm going to try and not go into the wider issues that you've just touched on there, and try and keep focused on low pay. But it's quite clear from what you're saying that the arrangements around sickness pay are an absolute driver towards in-work poverty and some serious problems and issues there. And I can see that Sam might want to widen it out to some other
well, again, it was just to add to that, and I think we'll probably come back to the bits of the gig economy, but talking about those business models which are kind of predicated on driving down terms and conditions, the issue around kind of for people who are in bogus self-employment. So there's lots of very good self-employment in London, but we would calculate about half of it would be forms of what we would term bogus self-employment. So that is lots of people in the gig economy who we would class as being workers who are not classed, and obviously they are not getting at the moment any access to sick pay, holiday pay, any of the other kind of additional conditions. Certainly not pensions contributions. So that kind of ticking time bomb there of we are looking at large numbers of workers in the capital who just don't have, as we discussed, any disposable income, so they're clearly not going to be putting any other money aside for pensions. So they might have the state's provision, but nothing on top of that. And lots of these companies who are, that's their the first way they met, and even companies who are in many ways sort of better employers, but did exactly as Tim said, in order to meet some of the increases in national living wage, kind of changed other terms and conditions. So, I mean, example across retail of the big supermarket chains closing down their staff canteens so that they were, what you've lost, you've got an increase in your hourly rate, but you're having to pay for your lunch in addition. Now, it doesn't sound like much to somebody, obviously that's a huge, if you're looking at £4 or £5 a day for that's an hour's wages for many people, particularly people who are earning under the 25 minimum wage. So you've got all of these kind of knock-on effects which are slightly hidden, but are absolutely what kind of, the members, our union members in London will be finding, and certainly people who are not members of the union even more.
Well, sorry, Helen.
And also the other thing we're finding with the outsourced companies is lots of pay errors. They're so common, in fact, that they have a whole pay query system. So what that means is if a worker's low paid and they've a pay errors then being made on top of that, and then they're having to go through this bureaucracy to get their pay back, and that will generally happen in the next pay cycle. And it's happening across the board on a regular basis. So you can imagine how that could impact people's bills, people's, council tax, etc., all the things they have to pay. The other thing that's happened very recently as well is that a private company called ISS changed their pay cycles, and in doing that they withheld pay from their hourly paid workforce for up to 3 weeks. It's going on right now. They offered these workers loans of their own wages to be paid back in a very short period of time. So we asked them to advance wages. They wouldn't do it. So we're in a situation where some workers couldn't even access the loans because they cut off the application date for the loan, and we've had to actually provide food banks on some of the hospital sites where ISS are operating. The union has had to do it because workers are so desperate. We've had a porter who hasn't eaten for 3 days. It's an example of one worker, how he's been impacted. He's the only breadwinner in the household. His children, people are just in desperate struggle, and these companies aren't listening to us when we're trying to make points or suggest what they should be doing to mitigate against. We've no objection to a company changing their pay cycles, and obviously we understand the reasons why they have to do it, but it's just what they're putting people through to make these changes is what we're...
Yes, I mean, everyone understands that businesses sometimes need to do that, but there are ways and ways to do it, and what you've just described is quite shocking. I am now going to move on to Caroline, who's going to ask the next batch of questions. Thank you very much for where we've got to so far, Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start with Amy and ask, how does the London Living Wage Foundation work with employers to increase the number of people who are paid the London Living Wage?
So we are very business facing, and the Living Wage Foundation was set up to celebrate employers who pay the voluntary living wage, that higher rate, £10.55 in London, £9 outside of London. We give them a living wage logo. If they sign up with us, they say we pay all of our directly employed staff a living wage, and we have a plan to move all of our third-party staff that provide us with a service. So think about your outsourced cleaners, caterers, security. They need to be moved up to the living wage over time. So as a contract is due to be renewed, or there is a break clause within that contract. That means we capture where we know there is low pay, particularly cleaning, catering and security. And then as an organisation, we focus very specifically in it's a place-based approach. So in different cities and regions of the UK, we focus on the largest employers in those spaces. So if you think about your universities, your local authorities, your sort of football, sports-related clubs, cultural institutions, transport hubs, we know that when we target those employers, and when they sign up as living wage employers, there is a ripple effect across the country and across that place. They typically will outsource some of their work to local companies, which means then you have local companies also paying the living wage. And there is a promotional aspect to it as well. So when an employer signs up as a living wage employer, we encourage them to publicly talk about it. They're on our website. It's a public commitment that they make to their staff and also to the community that they work in, to say we are paying our staff the socially acceptable, recognised standard of pay as a minimum, and we will continue to do that. It's a long-term commitment. But what we've done some research, and what we've actually found is that the impact of paying the living wage in a place is there is a financial impact to that, and got some stats here, but if a quarter of low-paid workers in the whole of the UK were moved up to the living wage, it would deliver an economic growth worth £560 million to the UK. That's on average a £1,700 pay rise for each low-paid person, but also it would deliver £350 million in tax receipts and benefits back to the Treasury, which is a good economic space and conversation and argument to increase wages. In London, if we were thinking London specifically, the London economy would grow by £294 million. That is a conservative estimate. Remember, only a quarter of low-paid workers would need to see a pay rise up to the living wage to see that. And workers on average would benefit by £2,700 a year. So it's a huge impact that if you pay the living wage in a place, you see some real impact to the economy. Alongside working with and trying to sign up anchor, we call them anchor institutions, large organisations, it's really important to us that the unseen workers are seen, which is why we include outsourced in what we do. If you think about, I've just done a process of looking at some freedom of information requests, and what we don't see in that are the third-party staff. It's quite difficult to get information. So it's like an unseen problem of low pay, and it's important to us that we continue to move in that space.
So if we've got all these benefits that you've just set out, sort of overall economic benefits, why, and also the benefits for those hidden workers, the outsourced workers, why do employers resist signing up for paying the London living wage? What are the kind of reasons that they cite for not doing it?
I hear lots of reasons, and ultimately it comes down to cost. I think where we see low pay in particular, and I think Sammy mentioned it earlier, the business model of lots of our lowest paying industries, retail, hospitality, social care, they are not set up to pay wages, as high wages as possible. They are based on as low margins for wages as they can manage. But I guess the flip side of that conversation is why employers do sign up, and there are sort of short-term and long-term benefits to paying a real living wage. The short-term is predominantly for the workers, and it is, the improvement in pay means that you are sort of happier, healthier, you're able to spend more time with your family if you don't have to work multiple jobs. Maybe you only need one job rather than two, or two rather than three. That's why the living wage campaign was started. That was what we were hearing from low-paid workers in East London. And it's not rocket science. You've got happier, healthier staff. They work better. They work harder. They're at work when they're at work. They're not thinking about how they're going to pay rent or pay for their food. But the long-term benefits are for the business then. So that impact of the workers being at work and being fulfilled and seeing that their employer values them means that the employer sees an impact in a reduction of turnover, staff turnover rates, sickness, absence. an improvement in things like relationships between staff and management. Some of our employers, anecdotally, because it's quite difficult to measure, have seen improvements in productivity, and all of those sort of long-term benefits, including the brand benefit of being associated with the living wage, mean that employers, when they put the whole of that business case together, because some of that is financially measurable and some of it isn't, when they put that together, it makes a good enough case to say, okay, we're going to invest in the biggest asset that we have, which is our people. And the over 5,000 businesses we have, they take that line. You know, they are our biggest asset, and we want to live our values out, and this is how we're going to do it.
One of the examples that sort of hit the press a little while ago was Waterstones, who responded that if you raise the bottom level really significantly, then everyone all the way up the company has to go up, and then we go bust. Now, do you think that actually the London living wage could be part of actually reducing the gap between the highest and the lowest paid, so that rather than seeing this as so that actually you've got a smaller gap from the highest paid to the lowest paid in a company, right up to the chief exec, so that the London living wage is about making sure that everyone can live well, rather than sort of seeing it as part of a linear thing that's stuck on what was before. I mean, do you think employers get that, or do you think that they're trying to do what that Waterstones spokesperson was talking about, i.e. seeing it completely within the current linear progression?
I think the living wage has a role in making our economy more equal, and ultimately it's about the lowest paid being able to have a decent standard of living. And the businesses that I work with, and you know, there are big retailers in that, Lush, IKEA, Majestic Wine, Richard Sounds, that, you know, they've all seen this and said what it's not going to do is mean we go bust. We're going to see it as an investment. And I was talking to a couple of them actually over the last couple of weeks, and Lush and Brewdog, for example, put the living wage in place when they weren't making any money, and now they are both thriving in a retail economy that's quite challenging. So they haven't seen it as, oh, we have to raise all the way up and it's going to exacerbate everything. But it's up to the business how they manage that, you know, their differentials and what they do. The ultimate reason for the living wage foundation and the living wage to be there is to lift the lowest paid up to a socially acceptable standard of living.
So you've just mentioned sort of quite a range of different kinds of sectors, sort of from IKEA to Lush. Are there particular sectors that you're targeting to get them to pay the London living wage that aren't at the moment, that you think could make a real difference if they embraced it?
I mean, linked to the place-based approach that we have, what we haven't seen are sort of football clubs, for example, across the country. We have a handful that pay the real living wage, but there are many more that can afford to that haven't. I think that's really key, and not just football clubs but other sporting institutions, but you know, there is money there to be paid. And I mean, the other real spaces that we see and we're working towards outside of the low pay areas, you know, retail and hospitality are important. We have a team that specifically focused on that, but universities as well. We know that the majority of universities can pay the living wage and haven't put that in place and should. They have a civic responsibility to do so. Yeah. And you know, we're working in some of those spaces as well. And you know, lastly, local authorities have a huge impact on their local economy in their local area. And when they sign up to be living wage, what we see is that more employers in that area also sign up to be living wage and pay more wages. So it's really focused on those large institutions and place-based approaches.
So what proportion of local authorities are paying the living wage? I mean, you'd have thought that every local authority would, but are there many that don't?
I can tell you who do. I think there are over 50 local authorities across the country that do.
15?
50.
50 across the country?
Across the country that do. And if you want more detail about that, we can get that for you.
That would be helpful if you could send it back to the committee. Thank you. And the other thing that would be useful to have details of is the number of Londoners who are paid the London living wage and the number of employers and which sectors they're in.
Okay. I've got some of that here. If you
if it's BD, yes, that'd be good.
The number of Londoners that are paid the living wage, I think it's 739,000, just over, and that is with 1,604 London living wage employers, so it's headquartered in London businesses. In terms of breakdown in sector, you've got mostly private companies, some public companies, and sort of a bigger number of third sector companies as well. So broadly, private companies are sort of leading that space, which is what you'd expect. There are more of them. And in terms of size, we have most of our network are SMEs. We've got a good chunk of micro businesses, but nearly 400 very large employers. So really representative of the UK economy in terms of employers.
Thank you. And what about apprentices? You said young people are often paid less than the living wage. Do you think apprentices should be paid the London living wage? If they're in a...
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the legal apprentice rate is probably too low, but apprentices aren't included in the living wage agreement that we have with businesses. However, as a big caveat, lots of our employers do pay the London living wage to their apprentices as well, so there's a measure of best practice there. But it's not something that we campaign on or will campaign on in the future. I think there is a space for that, though.
So, certainly, because it's another group of young people who are earning poverty pay. Thank you. I'd like to move on to Tim, if that's okay, and look at how many Londoners are paid below the legal minimum. So, how many Londoners are paid below the legal minimum wage? The data sort of reports how many Londoners are paid below from a derived amount, sort of a weekly amount divided by the number of hours. So it's subject to two lots of caveating. Okay,
It's
official, but in terms of the numbers, I haven't got the numbers to hand, but we published a document last week that showed the proportion of those paid less than the minimum wage, and it was highest in London and the southeast. Those measured as being paid less than the minimum wage. There's a higher proportion of all those on the minimum wage in London and the southeast and other areas.
Do you know why that?
Partly because the numbers paid less than the numbers paid on the minimum wage in London and the southeast is lower than in all other UK areas.
And so, why do you think employers are paying below the legal minimum? Because they can get away with it.
Partly because they can get away. I mean, so the data has some concerns about how accurate it is. So it's based on employers reporting this. Most of the non-compliance we would expect wouldn't be in those data because we expect that it's in the informal sector where most of it happens. There's a big question mark about gig economy, outsourcing, etc., and whether those workers are entitled to the minimum wage or not. And lots of cases are going through tribunals at the moment with contradictory outcomes and very dependent on the specific circumstances. Sorry, can you question again?
So I just said, why do you think they pay below the legal minimum?
But if they do, it's because they can get away. And we've had research that's looked into why employers pay less than the minimum wage, and some of the employers' attitudes are quite surprising given we're in the 21st century, in that they'll argue that it's for students or others in the household where it's not a main income, so therefore it's pin money, and therefore
so women
we can get away with it. Yeah, in a lot of it might be in ethnic minority employment, whereby it's not just say in restaurants, etc. It's a sort of family connection, a sort of local community connection. It's very difficult to make a complaint against the employer without.
So is it so that kind of underpayment is very difficult to enforce, presumably?
Yeah, because there's also some connivance potentially between employer and with regards
and coercive control as well, presumably as well within relationships. So what does the Low Pay Commission do? Do you have any role in enforcing, or what is the enforcement mechanism?
Right. So the enforcement mechanism, so we don't have any direct role in enforcement. So our department, the Department for Business and Energy Industrial Strategy, they are responsible for the national minimum wage policy, and they outsource the enforcement to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And the minimum wage is the only, apart from health and safety, is the only enforceable right that's done by the state. All other employment rights, you have to go to the employment tribunal and take individual cases. And in order to, for HMRC to investigate, they have sort of two planks of their strategy. One is there's an ACAS hotline, so anyone can phone up that hotline and say, I think I'm being paid less than the minimum wage, and that case will be investigated. So all those cases are investigated, anyone phones the complaints line. And there's also some proactive HMRC investigations, which are risk-based strategies, so they pinpoint particular areas, particular sectors where they think that minimum wage underpayment is likely to be stronger. As part of trying to strengthen that mechanism, the new office of the Director of Labour Market Enforcement is trying to bring together the strategy of enforcement. So is overseeing the roles of the HMRC minimum wage officers, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, and the Employment Standards Agency. So bringing those together to try and have a more strategic think about how to get more compliance and reduce non-compliance. But those three bodies come from very different backgrounds, have very different sort of financing. I mean, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority is more at the anti-slavery end of the spectrum, whereas HMRC's revenue officers are sort of looking more at sort of official companies and going and looking at records of non-payment.
Do you think there's anything that anyone could be doing much more of that's an obvious gap in terms of enforcement?
Well, clearly, because we hear anecdotal cases of non-compliance, more can be done. But a lot is currently being done, and it's there's been huge increases in resources, particularly for the Majesty's Revenue and Customs, on the minimum wage side. It takes time to train enforcement officers up, so part of the delay in sort of maybe seeing immediate increase in numbers is sort of training up the workforce to do that, but that should happen. And also the Director of Labour Market Enforcement bringing together and making recommendations that the government can act on. But as we hear from our trade union colleagues, there are still lots of evidence of non-compliance and firms being very sort of grey in what they do.
Caroline, I've got a couple of others who are very keen to come in now.
Do you want to?
If I could just bring you in before we go on. Susan and then Fiona.
Thank you. Yes, I'll be very quick. I mean, having employed people for years, periodically you've always had people come in and check your PAYE systems, to check for that. If you've got businesses doing deals with members of staff for cash, that's very, very difficult for Inland Revenue, etc., to look into, and it does go on all over the place, and that's a difficulty. And I don't know how one addresses that, because the employee shouldn't allow that either. Employers most certainly shouldn't do it, but employees, if they take cash in hand and don't pay tax, they're compliant with the whole thing going wrong. I'll leave it at that. There's other things I want to...
Okay, so that's the issue of people working off the books and just not getting into the tax system at all, which is another...
Some firms have a combination of some of the hours will be on the books and some of the hours won't.
Yes,
they do.
Or two sets of books, which we find quite common in textiles.
Fiona.
Okay, I've got two questions and I'll try and sort of keep them quite tight. One is about awareness by employees, and this might be something that Helen could come in as well, because, for example, in the hospitality industry and in sort of some of the low-paid areas of work, particularly in London where we've got quite high levels of migrant workers, is there a job to be done around sort of making sure people are really clear what their basic employment rights are? Because I think some of the work done by Unite with their hospitality branch indicates that actually there's quite a lot of people working in those industries who don't necessarily know what their rights are, because they're potentially sort of just not aware of that. And the other question I've got is around devolution of enforcement to local authorities, which I think is some time ago there was a paper by Centre for London recommending that enforcement was devolved to local authorities as sort of organisations that would be coming into much greater contact with some of the areas of the employment market where there is sort of lack of compliance. So that's two quite different questions, but I just wondered if you could comment on those.
So I know you want to bring in Helen, and I can see that Sam is very keen to get in here as well. So if we start with Helen and then go to Sam, and then if any of the rest of you want to comment on that.
In terms of the rights, people understanding their rights, yes, there is the issue of language barriers, and there's the issue of people literally not knowing their rights. So we're working quite hard to address that in GMB Trade Union on my sites. The other issue is sometimes people know their rights, but they're so oppressed by management. And I think it comes back to your point about the cash in hand being given. There's a power imbalance in these relationships, and workers are literally terrified, and they will do whatever the manager says to them. And we had a situation in Kingston Hospital where a worker was actually assaulted by a manager just before Christmas. This sort of thing is going on. People are getting shouted at. There's a real power imbalance here that needs to be taken into consideration, and it is, as the colleague said here, coercive control is involved as well, and people are just under horrendous levels of pressure, really, and they'd like to, they feel they can't, if they understand their rights, they can't even, we've had, for example, in GMB union protests, we've said to workers, come on your break on a protest, it's your right, and they're fearing they'll be sacked, they'll be bullied for doing things like that, so it's a very, very difficult area.
Sam.
So a series of really good questions, but I can send to the committee on the back of a low pay commission report last week, I think on the 26th we put out 19 recommendations on things that could be done to improve enforcement in the UK as a whole, but obviously lots of them are very relevant to London, so there's a whole range of stuff there, and some of those are things which actually the Assembly and the Mayor could support in terms of enforcement, and the points were made there around kind of links between increasing funding for HMRC enforcement, which has seen an increase in finding out cases of underpayment, but also the need to support the Game Masters licensing. There's a whole other inquiry there on what we can do to support undocumented workers in our capital, and part of the issue is we know we've got a higher percentage of undocumented workers here than virtually anywhere else in the country, so that's a big issue. So I won't go through the 19 recommendations, I can just send those in. In terms of making sure people know their rights, again, this is an area where I think there's quite a lot that could be done to help. Certainly when I was a GMB organiser a long time ago, we had leaflets in lots of different languages that just set out basic employment rights. And in the past, I think this was changed when the government changed, with EU accession countries, anyone who was applying to come and work when they were still accession countries would get a letter jointly from the TUC and I think the Home Office in the language of their country, just setting out what the basic employment rights were. So it would say you are entitled to this minimum wage, you are entitled to this sick pay, this kind of thing, and they would get that, and we did that in those languages, and I think that's been discontinued. I know that the GLA is looking at a new portal for kind of workers' rights where all of that information would be up there. And just relating this back to the apprenticeship point, where we are very much campaigning for apprentices to get the London living wage in London, and a number of London boroughs, Southwark, definitely make sure that all of our apprentices get the London living wage, and apprentices who are working for organisations who are working to them, they use their procurement powers to do that. Camden are about to introduce the same. But we have things like a pay calculator, a new app which is coming out, so any apprentice can go online and see what they should be entitled to, because just to come back to the apprentice point, I mean, we think the apprentice minimum wage is ridiculously low, £3.40, but actually when you look at the research we've done on that across sectors like construction, hairdressing and social care, between 25 and 30% of apprentices in those sectors aren't even getting the national apprentice minimum wage, which is £3.40. So I think in construction it was 29% when we did a survey last year with the Manny Work Centre, so we can get you that information. But I mean, it is shocking, the abuses at that level. I say that there are improvements, as Tim was referring to, there is being more kind of enforcement, but they are absolutely shocking rates.
29% are getting paid.
Are not getting. Yeah. So we'll send the stats. I don't want to get this wrong on the record, but it's between 25 and 30% across those sectors. And not even getting the already very low apprenticeship minimum wages. So I said we've got an app which will be released shortly, which will be for any apprentice can kind of look at where they are, what their age is, varies according to age and stuff, varies according to which year of the apprenticeship you're in, and very quickly kind of find out what the absolute minimum they should be on. And that's just part of the union contribution, trying to make sure that people are aware of their rights. But I think the language issues and getting basic rights to colleagues is crucial. And so there's quite a lot that the GLA could do to support that. I'll come back to that later.
I mean, we're very happy if you've got additional information for you to send it to us afterwards, so that as we conclude our investigation into this, it's able to inform what we're putting forward as recommendations to the Mayor and as a result of our looking at this area. Amy, are you wanting to come in? No. Okay, I'm going to move on to Fiona's questions now, so coming straight onto Fiona.
I just want to, nobody commented on the devolution point, so I just wondered whether somebody could comment on
to
that.
local authorities. Yeah. Yes, I mean that's. I think a lot of them have gone into joint partnerships now on regulatory services, and many of them, of course, have cut staff in this area. So I'm not sure how vibrant enforcement in this area it actually is.
So we are slightly wary about devolving enforcement powers completely, because we think actually a lot of this should sit at national level, and where you look at things like the child labour regulations, which are devolved to local authorities, and actually because of exactly as you said, because of cuts and stuff, actually that gives you quite a patchy picture of what's happening. Often not local authorities' fault, but it's difficult, and it's difficult to follow up, so it's kind of, and it can create links. However, having said that, there are some really interesting examples of where local authorities have been kind of linking up stuff. So if we look at Newham, where we've done that really innovative stuff on their housing enforcement and linking up kind of enforcement on kind of preventing shed stuff, but also kind of a wider thing of actually saying, well, where we know there are abuses of hygiene regulations, etc., we're likely to find other abuses. And certainly a very initial conversation, other colleagues might know more, Newham were looking at kind of starting to do that on minimum wage stuff as well, so that kind of cross-authority approach to violations, and saying this is much more likely, you know, there are bits of a local authority which will pick up on issues, and if you've got kind of violations of hygiene and kind of, you know, fly tipping and stuff where businesses are doing that, there's a very good chance that they're the ones who are likely to be kind of most likely to be exploiting undocumented workers, most likely to be paying under minimum wage, most likely to be kind of putting people in tied accommodation. And so I don't have any more kind of details of that at the moment, but we had a very initial conversation with colleagues in Newham, and I know there are some other boroughs that were looking at that as part of their kind of local industrial strategies. So that again might be something that the committee would want to look at, but we think, so not necessarily full devolution of enforcement, but much greater cross-authority working and then linking up with the agencies that do exist, HMRC, game rosters and abuses, licensing, etc. We think there's a lot more that can be done there.
Okay, and obviously when people start working in the UK, they get a national insurance number. Is there a greater role for government in terms of sending out basic information about employment rights at that point, at whatever age people sign up for a national insurance number?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Tim, did you want to comment on this?
Just to come back on that, as we were asked to look at the Taylor recommendations last year, and we produced a report which had recommendations, and one of which was that on day one, workers should be given the sort of set out their rights, including what their pay would be, what would be expected, what hours were expected, etc. We also made other recommendations about shift cancellation and curtailments on payment for or compensation if that happened, and also for notice of shift changes being, not last minute. And in terms of awareness, there was in 2010 all publicity was immediately stopped at the incoming coalition government, and it didn't really pick up again until about 2015. However, you're probably aware of various radio adverts currently that are advertising the national living wage, and workers so I've heard on many radio stations of advertising that. And in terms of devolution of enforcement to local authorities, we have the same concerns as Sam, that it doesn't become a postcode lottery, it doesn't become sort of those firms in certain local authorities would be more clamped down than others. But we also welcome local authorities working closely with enforcement agencies to clamp down on any non-compliance. And we've, again, as the example of Newham, we've seen it with Newham and chicken restaurants. We're working with the border agency, the minimum wage compliance officers, and health and safety that the local authorities do.
That's interesting, thank you. And a couple of the questions I had, I think, have been covered. So I'll move on to one around welfare reform. As members of the panel will be aware, the Mayor doesn't have responsibility over welfare reform, although I think he's raised a number of issues around welfare reform direct with the government. As clearly the reforms do have an impact on the numbers of Londoners living in poverty. What changes do members of the panel think that the Mayor should lobby the government on that would be of the most benefit to low-income Londoners?
I can start with this. There are a few, we've published a couple of reports on universal credit, essentially, being the main plank of the welfare reform that's going on. First is the 5-week wait. You have to wait 5 weeks if you're going on to universal credit for your money, and that's driving many people to food banks and into debt and so forth. So I think we actually had Bright Blue, which is a sort of centre-right think tank, published a report which recommended that at the moment you can get a loan up front. You have to pay it back. That's transferred into a grant, so you get essentially the burden goes onto the state to provide money up front. So you're not struggling for 5 weeks, which is unacceptable. A few other things, the 2-child cap obviously has a significant impact on children, on families that have 1 children. Restoring the link between inflation and cost of living, uprating benefits in line with the way that prices are going. Generally, allowing fortnightly payments, for example, payments to be split in households, so they don't just go to the main. I've got a list. I think there's many other very, very sort of micro aspects of the way universal credit is working. And there's the overall benefit cap of 23 grand in London, which is per household, which is doesn't cover what you need to live, basically.
Okay, thank you. And I wondered if members of the panel could also comment on what the Mayor could do directly to increase the amount of better paid jobs in outer London, where has been observed in your presentation as well, Manny, around a particular issue in outer London.
I think the sort of economic development model is to build up the centre and have people coming into the centre from outside, which is very, very dominant sort of economic thinking at the moment. I'm sure there are ways in which the Mayor can leverage his powers to help people to invest in outer London areas to build clusters and agglomerations in outer London. And I think, but that is very much counter to where I think the way economic policy is sort of going at the moment. Yeah, I think that sort of is. We've recently released a very, very long report published by the Smith Institute on outer London living time, which has about 50 different recommendations. For example, one of them, which I'm not necessarily we subscribe to, is to sort of not put Crossrail through and to increase transport infrastructure spending in outer London to ensure people can get from borough to borough rather than just coming into the centre, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just to come in on that, I think that it would be helpful, I think, if the Mayor uses influence to encourage every London borough to have a place-based plan to improve the number of living wage jobs in that space. So thinking about large employers in the different outer London boroughs and how they can offer living wage or above jobs, essentially.
So I think I think we would almost certainly agree with everything which was for London are saying on universal credit at the moment and the welfare issues. We have a project called London Unemployed Strategies, which is a claimant support group which sits in our TUC region, but is funded by Trust for London at the moment. So take that as read that we would. It's a flawed system at the moment, although principles would be okay if it was properly funded and done properly. But just in terms of our Outer London jobs issue, actually I think within the London economic strategy, there's been some quite good stuff that the Mayor has been saying around kind of centres and using planning kind of power. And actually, when we're just in the process now, as I'm sure the committee will be involved with, on looking at the local industrial strategy for London, and a key bit of that is going to be place-based stuff. I think that's really important, and I think actually across London there are some really positive schemes. So if you look at Barking and Dagenham and the Look East project, which is kind of, they put a lot of money into regenerating a huge site, major pharmaceuticals thing, quality jobs, but left, but actually working with the local authority there, working with the company before they left. It's going to be biggest new film studios for 2 generations. There's lots of other kind of locations, and that's been supported by the GLA, but very much a kind of Barking and Dagenham project, and that is about high quality, decent work at a local level. And I think actually there are initiatives like that in a number of London boroughs where kind of issues around planning gain, etc., where the authority has got a role and the Mayor's office have got a role. And I think that's been positive, but we need to see more of that. And that is one of these classic issues about the number of strategies which you have in the GLA, and the Assembly has kind of oversight of, and how we actually link those up. So with the local industrial strategy, which obviously a government prescribed thing, all LEPs need to be working on, kind of making sure that place-based approach is there, is very important, but that needs proper oversight from groups like your committee, but also involvement from all of the people who are here as well.
I think the role of transport shouldn't be underplayed. Yeah. Getting transport from places where people live to where these hubs are, and making it easy, accessible, and at the right times of day and the right regularity to cater for not just full-time jobs but part-time and flexible working as well.
There is a big conundrum though with all of this about London, is that if you improve the transport links, make local services better, they become more desirable places to live and they become more unaffordable places to live. And I just think that I mean, the Smith Institute report I mentioned earlier on, there is no exit from that kind of conundrum except for build more affordable social housing, essentially, and more affordable housing. You make outer London better jobs, better transport links, but it just becomes more expensive to live.
The link between supply and demand is pretty clear in housing, and there's an undersupply, hence prices have gone up. We need to sort out, rather than doing demand side stuff like Help to Buy, which just stokes the market, we need to do a bit of supply side.
Yeah.
Onka, just bring you in next.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about other determinants of poverty, in-work poverty apart from low wage. So let's start from you, Tim. What weighting do you give to a low wage compared to the increasing cost of living in London?
With the national minimum wage or national living wage, it's by definition it's national. So according to the National Minimum Wage Act 1998, the way that's set up the national minimum wage, it cannot vary by geography, industry, occupation or size of firm. So we're prevented from doing any of those. But when we've looked at regional or country minimum wages, usually it's the within area differences are greater than the between area differences. London might potentially be an exception, but there are low paid parts of London as well as we know, very on average, much higher paid. So in terms of how much lifting a minimum wage can do, it can only do so much. It's quite a blunt tool. It just shifts the bottom up. It can't guarantee any ripple effects. It can't guarantee any effect. And I think whether there's a sort of policy vacuum at the moment is on wages above the minimum wage. In that the last 40 years of labour market policy in the UK has generally been about reducing wage pressures rather than encouraging them. We should be looking at that as maybe that's one of the reasons why real wages are now 6% below what they were in 2008. So in terms of sort of answering your question, the minimum wage can only go too far. We need to perhaps look at other ways of empowering workers to force up wages elsewhere in the distribution. But in terms of poverty, it's addressing those issues that really determine poverty. So it's housing, it's childcare, it's transport, which isn't necessarily related to anyone's individual work and pay. And it's also the circumstances of the household, whether there's one or two working parents, whether they're lone parents, whether, and not only just for childcare as well, it's also elderly care becomes much more important, and it's transitions into and out of the labour market. We know that when women leave the labour market to have children, they generally come back in at a lower grade or part-time, so that they lose wages, and that's a permanent loss throughout the rest of their careers. We need to perhaps think about how we keep those who take time out to look after children and the elderly, how they can be incorporated in the workforce and not lose a lot of their expertise and skills, or get penalised for doing so.
And what do you think the Mayor can do about the cost of living, affecting the cost of living, or to reduce the cost of living in London?
In terms of the practical things, I think it's sort of one of the largest costs is housing. It's how we might be able to tackle housing in terms of increasing the total amount of housing units. But then that does come up against some of the other government policies that are driving up house prices and rents. But transport is sort of making it more affordable for people to get from A to B through whatever transport systems there are would help.
Thank you, Manny. What factors of in-work poverty do you give most weighting to? Low pay or high costs? And are there other reasons for the increase of London's living in work poverty?
I think both sides of the equation have to be tackled together. So increasing incomes and reducing costs. I think there's something that I haven't been talked about, which is about sort of contributing towards in-work poverty. It's education. So one of the things, there's two things: adult education, but there's school-age education. One of the things we often fall back on is, okay, so tackling poverty is a generational thing. If you're growing up as a child in a household in poverty, you get an education, you go to university, that sort of traditionally is the route out of it for you to hopefully do better than your parents' generation. Actually, research that we're about to publish by the Social Market Foundation in London shows that if you come from a disadvantaged background in London, it doesn't necessarily, and you go to school, you get good grades, you go to university, it doesn't necessarily translate to good employment outcomes, because the labour market is sort of rigged against you, because you don't have the cultural capital, you don't have the social capital to be able to get into decent careers which have sort of good routes up the income spectrum. There's one particular bit where London seems to fall down. So it does well in schools up to about 16, get good GCSE results. But if you grew up in London, then go to further education, get them mixed up all the time. You seem to drop off there a little bit. There's that sort of sixth form college bit which doesn't seem to do so well for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then even if you go to university, the cards are stacked against you when you get in there as well. So there's something about sort of school age opportunities. Then there's something about adult education as well. I think it's increased massively agenda. I'm sure that my union colleagues will know much more about it than me, but there's a lot of work to be done to prepare people for the changes that are happening in the labour market, tying in automation, displacement of work, new opportunities that come out of that, with getting people out of low paid. I mean, the problem with the education bit and in-work progression is that the incentive isn't always there for the employers to invest in human capital, because the best way to get a pay rise is to change jobs. So you invest in human capital, people, the fear is people sort of leave. So there's that too. The cost stuff is really tricky, and we need to do more at the Trust of London for that. We are investing in, as I said in the presentation, Fair by Design, which is a social investment fund. I think there's a big space for socially responsible business to be able to offer products and services to low-paid workers that aren't exploitative. The mayor, I think, is doing some stuff around energy and the green energy company, I think that's some stuff there, and utilities could be something where the mayor does some stuff.
Yes, sir.
Just to come back, we've all seen reports recently on kind of the absolute stalling on social mobility, and that historically London, we probably had better mobility than some other bits of the country. That seems to go backwards, but it really does feed into this lack of progression point we've had across various sectors of the economy, where you would have thought you'd kind of move up over time in the job, up the kind of pay ladder. But we had a big report on hotel workers last year which showed there's just virtually no mobility kind of on pay there, and people just aren't moving up. This comes back to the kind of very initial points around kind of flatter structures where people are not moving up. And so I think our General Secretary certainly has been talking a lot more around the kind of class ceiling in London, as well as issues around kind of gender, ethnicity and disabled workers as well. That cuts across. So the point Manny made there around the devolved adult education budget to London, which is going to be very important. There's already some very positive stuff which we've seen there on pilots around making sure that anyone who is on the London living wage or below will still get free access to stuff, and that's being kind of piloted in London, which is very important. But there's other stuff we can do with that. I'm not an expert on the skills agenda, but we've got union colleagues who sit on the Skills and Business Partnership for London, and other people who are kind of feeding into that. And there's a real role there for what you can do and can be done to support career progression, and some very interesting kind of programmes already on kind of trying to get people from different backgrounds kind of moving up, working with good companies. And I think we're going to come back to this with questions on the Good Work Standard, so I won't go into that as a kind of positive thing. But just in terms of those other issues, childcare, transport and housing, so two areas there on housing. Obviously, the Assembly has a direct role on supporting a massive increase in affordable housing in London. And on transport, again, colleagues have referred to this, the fact that we are now, or the fact that we're the only capital city that don't have any subsidy from central government for our transport system. So despite the mayor freezing the bits of fares which he has control over, which is very positive, actually we're still seeing an increase in transport costs, as we know, because we don't have control over train companies coming into London. And so you're seeing that increase, we know, because of a housing issue. People are being forced out further, so they're paying more every week, every month on their fares. And so again, it's all joined up stuff, and unless you start to tackle that, you're not going to crack this. So it's pay is absolutely crucial, but reducing costs is important as well. And so how there's a holistic approach on that is very difficult. So I think on transport, it's saying, well, look at what the London economy puts back into the national economy, and actually we should get some of that back. And on housing, it's really effectively using the powers that the mayor does have on planning gain to actually increase the amount of affordable housing, with all the pressures that we know in the real world that then leads to of increases. But we are seeing people being forced further and further out. So again, we can send in our analysis on childcare. It's gone up 3 times as much as wages in London. Extreme commuting, because of the amount of Londoners that are being pushed out, as we know, and links back to all sorts of other issues there. But so there's lots of positive stuff that is going on, and I think there's more working together, but part of it is getting all of those strategies joined up at City Hall level, because there's good stuff, lots of good stuff going on, but it's sometimes a bit siloed.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be good if you send us stuff through the chair. But I'll come back to you in a minute, Sam. But let me go back to Manny again. How do you? What was the point? Do you want to make something which I already said?
Kind of expand on the points that have been made by colleagues, and looking at the public services as employers.
Sorry, Helen, just before we bring you in, Susan indicated she just specifically wanted to come in on the point that was under discussion there, and then we'll come back to you.
Sorry, it's just a quick one. And you've got a really good point with the cost of travel. Now, TfL workers get free travel passes, but they also get a free one for anybody that they know. So in that case, do you think it would be better that instead of the mayor giving the free passes to just whoever they know, that they were in some way directed to people on lower incomes or the poor?
So I don't know the specifics of the family kind of assistance travel thing, which people get. There is a big issue at the moment in terms of the RMT union pointing out that outsourced cleaners on the underground, of whom there were about 3,000, weren't getting any kind of free travel, were actually being charged when they were at work to travel between stations. So that was definitely an issue which we took up around the fact that cleaners working, I've just forgotten, ABE, whoever the contractor was, should get the same travel benefits as TfL staff members. And that hasn't been met for cost reasons, where they are now getting free travel when they're at work, so they're not having to pay for their own travel cards to move between stations when they're cleaning. So I wouldn't like to comment on the specifics of the benefits which apply to TfL staff on mobile travel, but I think there is definitely an issue around support for apprenticeships and travel for under 18s, people at sixth form and travel assistants and stuff, which the mayor could be looking into. But I think we all accept there's an issue about where the money for that comes from.
This is my point. I mean, TfL have got £1 billion black hole. But so therefore, because your point is very well made, if people on very, very low incomes could get subsidised travel or whatever, the money would have to come from somewhere. I'm asking you whether you think it would be a good idea if it was taken from these free passes that any family member or any friend actually can have from those workers.
I think we'd argue that as that's an existing term and condition for those staff, that would be something that would be very difficult to change. But as I said, that actually the fact that we had the subsidy for TfL removed from central government was probably the crucial indicator there, because that was just a much larger sum of money which could be used for direct investment, which has a massive net gain to the economy of just London and the wider regional economy as well. So I think that would be what we'd be looking at as being part of the solution to putting the funding in.
Yeah, the trouble is you can't just give money away when it
No,
isn't there. That's where it could come
I think
from.
we'll come back to Helen now, because we've pursued that in a couple of
very
questions
much.
there.
I mean, it all
Thank you.
feeds into the general point, but just thinking of public services as employers and the NHS as like a massive employer. I mean, the things we've seen are the driving down of pay terms and conditions within the NHS and other public services, and outsourcing and funding cuts sort of higher up are responsible for both of those things. And we also see the abuse of outsourced workers, as we've discussed, and it comes into, questions have to be raised really about, the job opportunities within the public services. They are going down the whole time. They're huge employers. We're looking at services being shut down and cut, people losing jobs. All of these things have to be tackled, I think, at a higher level, or else we're kind of just tinkering at the edges, really. And I think outsourcing definitely is a huge factor in driving down pay terms and conditions. And that needs to be looked at, maybe look at insourcing of contracts, getting people, because what we're seeing as well is people on NHS contracts, it's like their contracts have been driven down to the outsourcing rate. We're being told, for example, in Epsom and St Helier, that they're not going to pass on the nationally agreed NHS Agenda for Change pay rise to people on NHS contracts now. So it is actively being driven down to the lowest common denominator, and this is leading to poverty and all of these issues that we're discussing.
We'll come back to you, Unga. Thank you for that.
So people who are outsourcing in the NHS, say for example you mentioned St Helens, right? They are not being encouraged to take from national NHS guidelines.
Well, they basically, when a contract is put out, and there's several bidders, say for example porters, cleaners, catering, generally because of funding cuts to public services, the trusts and social services are in a position where they have to go with the lowest cost. And that creates huge problems then, and that means it's just cutting things down all the time. And the other issue is if people are on NHS contracts, and they want a promotion within, the health service, the company turns around and says to them, well, you have to go on our lesser contract now. So the whole time it's been people have just been driven down into poverty in public services. They're huge employers, and they're, it's a huge problem, that does need to be tackled. And, we want contracts, we want things brought back in-house, people on proper nationally agreed NHS pay terms and conditions. We want people on decent contracts with the hours written in, not on 0 hours. Some of these contracts that the outsourcers provide, they're not in line with legislation even. That's literally, what we're facing.
Well, I do have a background in NHS, and I don't want to get too hooked onto the NHS.
Yeah.
But
we're talking across, not just the NHS, but across public services.
Yeah.
I mean, local government, they're huge employers.
I accept that. No, I agree with you entirely. But let me just go back to Manny. How do we use what we already know, right, about households and which particular groups are affected, right? Okay, how can we target our inputs, right, to help those households which are most at risk, right?
There's quite a bit of stuff. So there's stuff around welfare and ensuring that people are accessing the welfare that they're entitled to, and that you have a proper functioning welfare system. Beyond that, I think if you look at how services are delivered, where are the touch points where you're coming in contact with where people are coming in contact with these families? We're about to publish some research in NERA around debt. And people who are coming to access to debt, and they're coming to advisors. When they come to advisors, can we then use those touch points to have a wider conversation about things? Local authorities have spent a number of years, probably a decade and a half, trying to bring that sort of one-stop approach into the way they do service delivery. So it's like the raft of measures, but across anything we fund really, which is about providing services to individuals. The more you tailor those services around those individuals, build them around them, design them around them, the better chance you have of success.
Well, I think one of the problem is the complexity of applying for these benefits, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's really difficult, right? I mean, I see this in my other jobs as a medical practitioner, as GP, that the complexity of problems which people have in the targets and the number of forms they have to get in and is almost going up the Mount Himalaya track, right?
It is, and universal credit is digital by default. Which adds another layer for a lot of people. And combined with that, you've seen a huge reduction in funding for voluntary services, advice services. It's not at the top of the list for local authorities at the moment to provide that kind of support to people, which is what people need.
And of course, that there's a 68% success rate of people who apply for appeal against the decision, right?
Yes.
Or not getting benefit, right? Because it's so complex, right? I, as a doctor, have some difficulty knowing how to answer those forms, right? Okay. But that was clearly, there is important. Sam, just come back to you. Why is there such a strong link between self-employment and in-work poverty?
I think if we look at the kind of the nature of self-employment now, and the number of people have said who we would argue are not, it's not genuinely self-employed. I said there are many extremely successfully self-employed people, and the economy needs people who are self-employed. I grew up with a parent who was self-employed, or my mum, single parent family, self-employed, and it was and it worked for us at that stage. However, what we're talking about is the number of people who are on forms of self-employment where actually, when you do the calculations, and I think colleagues here have worked on this, about half of people on self-employed at the moment would earn less than the minimum wage if you looked at it calculated across an hourly rate. And often means people it wasn't a voluntary choice to go into self-employment. So you've either got people who are working for companies where they are being labelled self-employed, but we would argue that various cases, as we know, going through the courts, are clearly not self-employed. So gig economy workers who are clearly working, we would argue legally should be covered. Or you've got other people who've been have not been able to access other forms of work, so have gone into self-employment, started up kind of small things, but are not being able to make ends meet. And so I think that we argue in our figures would cover, I think this is right, again, don't want to misquote the figures, but I think there's about 1.2 million people who are classed as self-employed in the UK at the moment, of whom we would argue about half are in forms that we would not consider to be genuine self-employment, and it's that half that we think are having a big impact on the figures on poverty and in-work poverty, and that comes back to the kind of wider points right at the beginning on insecure work. So we talk a lot about issues around people on 0 hours contracts, but insecure work also includes for a larger number of people who are on short hours and a larger number of people who are in forms of self-employment that we don't think are genuine. And a percentage of that, to come back to Susan's point around people who kind of might be including with it, so there are definitely bits of industry where people have kind of come off the books but are doing it, but actually what we're seeing now is far more business models where people would like to be on the books and classed as an employee, but are being told by labelling firms like Uber or others that they're not, that they're a self-employed person, despite the fact they are clearly kind of absolutely linked. And that is having a massive downward push on wages. And as I said, in London, where that sector of the economy is much bigger, it's having a bigger impact here than it is elsewhere. But I'm sure colleagues would know. Colleagues would have more stats on that as well. So,
and also, what has been the impact of the Taylor Review since it's come out? And could more have been done with it?
So, again, we would argue the impact of the Taylor Review has been, well, the Taylor Review itself didn't go far enough. And then in its recommendations, even the recommendations that he did make haven't yet been followed through by the government.
Mm-hmm.
And again, very happy to submit our things. So there were 4 areas. Look at my notes, I'll find them in a second. But certainly on the issues around what counts as an employee or worker, on the points around people having kind of day one rights in the job, on issues around things like union representation, online balloting, etc. There are a whole range of areas where we think Taylor could have gone a lot further. But I said, even where he's made recommendations, we've yet to see any follow-up on those recommendations from government. So it was a kind of, TUC's line is it was a missed opportunity twice, both in the fact that it could have gone further, but even where there were some positive recommendations, we've yet to see them followed up by the government, partly due to the government being fully occupied by other issues.
We won't mention them here.
But yeah, let's not stay off.
No swearing, please.
So, Sammy, it'd be very helpful, right, if you write to the chair about the Taylor Review and what could have done and what hasn't been done. Very helpful. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, and we're going to move on to Susan now, who's going to ask the next group of questions.
Right, okay, this is a difficult one because if we knew the answer to this, I think there wouldn't be an issue. The question is, how do we help people in London rise above the minimum wage? Has anybody got a simple answer to that? No.
Yes. Support unionisation and rebuild collective bargaining in London.
You see, the trouble is, we're talking always about workers. We must also bear in mind that there's a hell of a lot of employers out there that are struggling, really struggling, would love to give their employees more money, but they're just not making the money. We are a nation of small businesses, and there are lots of instances. There's lots of instances where they could and they don't, granted, but there are lots of instances.
I just come in on that
specific
point because the businesses I'm dealing with are transnational, multi-billion businesses like ISS, who don't even provide, a day one sick pay scheme for their employees.
But that's what I've just,
about the SMEs,
but that's what I've just said. There are lots that could and don't.
Yes.
But we must appreciate that there are lots that would but can't because of rents going up and numerous other problems. Nobody ever talks about employers, and lots of them are suffering. Not clearly the ones you're dealing with, and I accept that unreservedly. But equally, you have to accept there are lots of employers of small businesses that would love to give their employees more and absolutely are just about making ends meet themselves. So there's something you mentioned, Tim, with flatlining lower job, well, I call them lower jobs, they're vital jobs, the cleaners, in a supermarket, the trolley collectors, etc. Do you think that will disincentivise people from trying to go up the ladder and the next step, and that won't help?
Yeah. Well, partly it reduces the opportunities.
Yes.
So, for example, anecdotally, although we haven't got sort of proper true evidence for it yet, so this is just anecdotally, in retail, some of the implications of the national living wage is basically some job loss higher up the hierarchies than we had traditionally seen. So deputy store managers, etc., with some of their responsibilities being transferred to supervisors and minimum wage staff. So before you'd have someone responsible for closing the store and cashing the tills. That's now sort of put on a lower role or lower paid role, and they're not getting the same payment for the responsibility that previously happened, and it sort of changes above the minimum wage, and that's affecting progression. And if we come back to outsourcing again, in the past we had vertically integrated firms, so that's where firms employed everyone from the cleaner all the way up to the chief executive. There was a sort of ladder. A cleaner could get a job working on the reception desk. You know, the opportunities came. You know, someone sociable, you offer them a job, and then the receptionist could then get a job further up, and there would be opportunities to do that. Outsourcing, so basically you're just working for a cleaning contractor, and you've just got a workforce of just cleaners. There's very little opportunity for advancement. You can perhaps become a supervisor, but then once you've got that, you then either have to move firms, in which you have to start again and get all that human capital and training again with a new firm, which then doesn't guarantee you advancement. So lots of those progression opportunities that used to be available are more difficult now than they used to be. And that affects people moving up and out of the minimum wage.
And that helps people to help themselves, which is what we should always encourage. Did you want to?
I mean, just on the business point, if I can go to the big looming change, which not confirmed yet, but may well happen, is a change to our immigration system, which will be a massive structural thing for businesses. If we move to an immigration system that is built on encouraging high-skilled immigration and discouraging low-skilled immigration, which is defined as under £30,000 a year, that has a massive impact on businesses. It will change the landscape for no-paid workers in London in particular. Obviously, those who come from abroad, and those businesses that rely on that kind of workforce, and that you can see that in many different ways. And there could be routes open for particular industries that could attract workers on visitor schemes or.
And it will drive wages up, no doubt, because demand and supply again, and it will go the other way. I mean, it could start tipping back anyway, because we're in fuller and fuller employment, aren't we? So, or if it goes back down. Right.
I think Sam wants to.
Sorry, Sam.
Sorry, I think it is so just 2 points, which is one, Helen's point, which is absolutely true, but many of the companies we're talking about clearly could afford to pay, particularly outsourced companies, but big hotel chains like Intercon, who agreed to pay the London Living Wage so that they could be part of the procurement chain for the London Olympics, and then have just announced recently that they're never going to meet that pledge. So there are big companies like that we need to look at. We'll come back to that about what could happen. But I think it is a very valid point, the one around support for SMEs. And if we come back to stuff around the good work standard and how that's been designed to try to make sure that actually there's support available for those companies to make the business case that Amy has argued for in terms of living wage, but actually when you talk to some of those smaller companies, what the net benefits to them in terms of retention, in terms of kind of staff, but there are more things that can be done there to make, I don't always like using a business case, but a business case for better pay. And there are other things which I said come under the London kind of economic kind of plans around business space and affordable rents and space for start-up enterprises, some of the advice for entrepreneurs in the capital, which is good stuff which is going on, where that can be linked into this type of advice on why it's important to actually treat your staff, if you've got one or two staff, kind of decently, why that is good in the long term for your business. So it's not, I don't think anyone kind of on our side would argue that we don't understand this point and that you're right, there are real pressures on smaller businesses, but there is support and guidance and advice which can be provided to help them be able to deliver that. And so we'll come back to this point, that doesn't work if your business model is predicated on driving it down, but it does help if actually what you're trying to do is the right thing, which lots of SMEs are trying to do the right thing. Yeah. They often need advice and support, and said the Good Work Standard has got some really good stuff there around how the GLA can kind of help businesses on that, I hate the phrase journey, but on that journey to move up in terms of the levels within the Good Work Standard. And has been designed, we think it could have gone further in lots of areas, but actually it's been designed to make sure that it is accessible for big and small companies, and that was a fundamental part of the work they were doing, kind of getting advice from the Living Wage Foundation and others around how you do that. Just said it's not, I think your point is valid.
Yeah, I mean, we did some work around small businesses, and one of the problems on some of them is that the employer, him or herself, are actually working flat out, just trying to keep things going. And everything else sort of flies out the way because they're working so hard to make the small business go, and we've done a lot of work on that in this committee. So it's a difficult situation. Amy?
As I said earlier, the majority of our network, the 5,000 we have signed up, are SMEs. So I think what we've seen is that the business case, as Sam said, actually has a real financial impact when you don't have to recruit and retrain consistently. That has more of a financial impact, arguably, on an SME than it can do on a multinational who have a team of people to do that, where it's just that one person running a business. So, I mean, the business case works. There's a small company, and it's not in London, in the south west. It's a caravan holiday park, and they don't recruit ever now. Their seasonal workers come back year on year. The people that they've kept for the last 3 years, and that means that they've been able to save a good sum of money on their recruitment and training of staff. So there is a real benefit for SMEs. They also are closer to their workforce. I think there's a little bit about SMEs really wanting to value the people that they employ and treating them well, and that's sort of what we've seen with the people that we work with, and the SMEs in particular, where they're closer to the issues that their workforce are facing, and they want to really support them and do something to support them in that, which is why I think we have so many signed up to the living wage, essentially.
Okay, it's a subject I could go on for hours, but I won't. We touched on this. I mean, if you look at the retail sector now, and I go back to some of my previous points, the retail sector is suffering greatly at the moment. Not only are rents going up unbelievably, but you can use companies like Amazon to get something. The cost of things are the same up and down the country, but the cost of rents, etc., aren't. So that does affect how they pay their employees, because clearly the employee cost is sometimes, or almost always, the greatest cost there. So how do you think we could help people in that particular sector? Do you think that we should be doing anything, or the Mayor should be doing anything in those particular, in the retail sector to assist?
I can see nodding from Sam.
Who wants to
start?
I'll start. I think there is a role for the Mayor to use convening power to bring those biggest employers together. One of the most difficult things is having the conversation with them and sharing the benefits of paying higher wages. In particular, in retail, there is a big cost benefit to you if you are able to reduce the turnover rates that you have, which are extraordinarily high, in particular in retail and hospitality and social care, like where we see low pay. Like, people move from one job to another for a 1-2 pence pay rise because pay is that low. And I think the Mayor could do something about bringing those people together to really help to understand how higher wages can benefit in that particular sector, how it benefits both the company but also the employee. And we've got some retailers who have signed up who have seen some real benefits from paying higher wages. And I think that's the main space that the Mayor could be supporting.
In an ideal world, I totally agree with all of you, but we're not in an ideal world, and I do see things from the other side.
Sure.
Having run a business for years, it's not always as easy as you think it is, and there are other pressures always that are going up and up. And when we're looking at this particular situation, we have to bear that in mind. There are two sides to this, and it's not always very easy.
Sorry, Chair, so echoing that point around kind of support that can be given in the retail sector, but it's a really interesting area, because this is an area where unionisation has been growing, and Usdaw, which is one of the main shop workers union, has actually put on large numbers of workers at a time when the overall workforce is decreasing, partly because they are really articulating kind of things which shop workers are talking about, which is not just pay but other things around kind of assaults and terms and conditions, working hours, etc. But actually there's a twofold here. So this comes back to part of the business practices stuff, where you have companies like Amazon and Sports Direct who are driving down kind of conditions, often in ways which are kind of directly kind of anti-competitive practices. So that thing around supporting, using the Mayor's voice to kind of call out some of that behaviour around companies who are not paying their taxes, who are basing themselves offshore, who are doing things which are which are just incredibly bad for our economy in the long term, but which is then putting pressure onto shops who are still trading on the high street. And whilst I genuinely don't agree with Waterston's boss about what he said. Kind of part of what they were saying was they are under direct pressure from Amazon and buying online. Now, one of the reasons people go to Waterston's is because you can still talk to a staff member and have that dialogue, and you get something else out of it. So you want committed staff members who can do the job, can tell you what the books are. For people who aren't just going to kind of go and buy online. So supporting all of the work which the Assembly and the Mayor have done on kind of supporting high streets, on actually investing in that, in putting money into regeneration of our areas with local authorities to make kind of actually the experience of going to retail and actually being served by a real person is very important and just contributes to what we need to do to keep that sector kind of alive. So I haven't explained that very well, but I think the Mayor has got a lot of powers has got influence that can be used both to call out bad business practice, which is an increasing pressure, and to make the kind of retail experience an attractive thing, and the convening power of bringing people together across the sector. This is one of the things we've started to talking to kind of people in the Mayor's office about bringing together the companies who are going to sign up to the Good Work Standard in retail and hospitality, and actually kind of bring them together with the unions to look at wages, productivity, skills, retention. We think there's a lot more that could be done there, and retail, when we've looked at where the key areas are in London where you could have the maximum impact on large numbers of low-paid workers, hospitality and catering, retail, social care, outsourced public services, or outsourced other services, kind of a crucial areas, and we think there's more that can be done there. And I say that's not to underestimate the pressure on the retail sector, it's huge, but there are things, the retail sector will evolve, and keeping decent staff in there is crucial.
Just to back up the colleague's point, I think particularly with companies like Amazon, there's huge health and safety abuses, like people can't even get to have toilet breaks as one example of that. And I think there would be a role for the Mayor maybe in using his influence to put legislation on the table, to stop companies exploiting workers, particularly multi-billion operations like Amazon. There's a real need for enforcement and legislation to stop some of the abuses that are going on within the warehouses and...
Okay, so I've got a couple of sort of wrapping up questions at the end. I think Amy has said that she has the details of the profile of employers that pay the London living wage, and I assume you've got some sorts of targets for people to sign up to become living wage employers. So it'd be really helpful if you could supply that detail to us, because we'd like to sort of see how that's progressing, and how much further it's going to progress, hopefully. But do you feel that the Mayor has been active enough in getting businesses to pay the London living wage? Is there anything else that the Mayor could do to back up the work of the Living Wage Foundation and getting employers signed up to the London living wage?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the Mayor's been doing a fair bit around the living wage. Like, the first thing is leading by example. So the GLA is an accredited living wage employer, which means that everyone is paid the living wage, and the third-party staff are moving on to the living wage as contracts are due to be renewed. And that also includes all of the subsidiaries that are sort of involved in the GLA, so you're looking at TfL, fire, police, etc. And they work really closely with our team on that. As you can imagine, it's quite a complicated process. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of people involved in that space, particularly within the supply chain. The Mayor also, all successive mayors have supported the Living Wage and Living Wage Week by announcing the London Living Wage at Living Wage Week in November. And this year, the team were really instrumental in the signing up of London Stadium. So they were really engaged with London Stadium, with Citizens UK, who were organising workers in that space, press and other stakeholders. And 3,000 people got a pay rise because of that, the work that the Mayor's office had done. They also provided the Living Wage campaign with free advertising space on the TfL network across Living Wage Week, which is sort of the biggest package of support the GLA has ever committed to the Living Wage campaign. And we are working with the team this year on a more ambitious campaign for Living Wage Week. We're hoping that we can reach more people, especially decision makers who use other methods of transport, not just the underground system. And I know the Mayor's written to 20 universities across London to encourage them to look at living wage and accreditation, and that work is ongoing. I think in terms of what more we would ask the Mayor and his team to be doing, I think the convening power is really important and bringing together key stakeholders in different industries. So we talked about retail, hospitality and social care, but actually there are employers that can afford to pay the living wage. Thinking about our football clubs and our stadiums, you know, there is a space to convene them and talk about the living wage and the benefits that could be seen in that space, as well as universities. But I think one of the other things that the Mayor could and should be doing is including London living wage in place-based plans. We talked about bringing some of the strategies together. Living wage is a really good space to see some impact for Londoners, like really positive impacts, and does need to be written into the place-based strategies that the Mayor will have. We've just launched a piece of work around living wage places and zones and buildings, working with local authorities across London. So Lambeth just launched the first living wage zone, I believe. So making sure that everybody in that place is paid the living wage, and living wage buildings, everyone that's working in a living wage building, they're all paid the living wage. So there's some real work to be done there. And I think what came out of the Social Mobility Commission State of the Nation report was a recommendation that the government should put the living wage in place for government departments, particularly the Cabinet Office, and spread that out through the procurement of government through the Social Value Act. And part of that social value framework for procurement, I think there is a space for the Mayor to use influence there with colleagues in the government to move that conversation forward. We know that if the government paid the real living wage, it would mean that third-party outsourced staff would also get the living wage, and the Cabinet Office in particular would be the space to make the most impact in terms of government. So there are some real asks, I think, for the Mayor, but continuing to work with us and being more ambitious in the space that living wage is seen. Part of the problem with living wage is that lots of people don't know about it. You know, they know about the minimum wage, but not what the real living wage is. And there is a real role for the Mayor and his team to put that living wage logo in as many places as possible to get the message out there about what the real living wage is and what the Mayor and his team are doing around it.
So that's on the London living wage side of things, but we also need to think about what the Mayor is doing, and could the Mayor do more to combat in-work poverty, and what has he been doing to help on that side of things. Is that something he can tackle alone? I would think probably not. Who else needs to take responsibility? And I want to ask that question to Sam and Manny.
So if we look at kind of, as I said, our starting point was London living wage as a base, but as you say, kind of fairer pay across London is crucial for tackling in-work poverty, along with tackling all of the other issues that we've discussed today. So just a couple of really concrete things that the Mayor has been doing and City Hall have been doing. But so the leading by example point I think is crucial in the pay audits in terms of the GLA family on not just gender but ethnicity and disabled workers' pay have been really important, and that's kind of a really positive example where you can do something which is kind of absolutely leading by an example. We haven't really discussed the Good Work Standard, but again, it's just a kind of very concrete contribution.
We are going to come to that just in a second.
Right, sorry. So in terms of taking that
forward,
I'll hold fire on that.
Yes.
But that links into this kind of wider point around how the GLA can use procurement kind of more effectively to actually kind of really support kind of decent standards and quality jobs in London. So again, the kind of commissioning power that you have, and we've got a meeting coming up with the team on that. There is obviously procurement policy, but we think that can go further in terms of, I said, the key points I was making around how you support access for unions just to talk to workers. Not all workers are going to want to join, not all sectors, but actually kind of actually getting the ability to talk to people and spread that message, and that procurement policy could be used more effectively for that. Just a brief mention of living wage zones and procurement, but we're in Southwark at the moment, and Southwark are doing some really interesting stuff on that, building on what Lambeth have done. So we've got a big living wage zone, which is where Haygate Estate used to be, which is going to be a living wage zone, but they've also just changing their procurement policies to go as far as they can legally with encouraging any of their suppliers to actually engage positively with trade unions, and that's kind of a really, and other councils are doing that, but Southwark is in my mind because I was talking to them the other day, but some really good stuff, and that kind of again comes back to things the Mayor can do, and the Assembly can do, around kind of just supportive statements, calling out bad practice, and I think the Mayor's already written to Bays as one of the 5 government ministries which is not paying the London living wage to all of its contracted out staff, to call on Greg Clark to actually do that. And so there are just, that's just one employer, but it's a kind of, that's obviously a totemic one because it's Bays, Ministry of Justice as well. So there's things there that we can do where actually that kind of that power. I mean, I would just absolutely come back to the convening point that using bodies like the Leap in London, Mayor's Office itself, to actually kind of get employers and unions and other stakeholders together and sit down and look at how we can link work on pay, productivity and skills to actually try and deliver on kind of outcome which we all want, which is a kind of a much fairer economic kind of system in London, but there are absolutely concrete things there that we could do to get business unions and others together in key sectors. And I think that's how you start to make a difference on the whole piece, not just on pay, but driving down in work poverty.
Do you want to add anything to that briefly? And then I'm going to bring in Caroline, who's going to talk about the Good Work Standard.
I'll very quickly talk about welfare, because not all welfare is central government, some of it's local government, local welfare assistance schemes, and there is a huge variety of provision across London. Different boroughs do it differently. That's council tax benefit, that's discretionary housing payments, that's local welfare assistance, that's essentially hardship grants. America work with London councils to get much more consistency across all of the boroughs on local welfare assistance, so that people who do get into crisis mode have some help there that can help them out a bit.
Yes, there's some very dreadful examples of people being rehoused out of borough and then not even being given any assistance travelling back to borough to enable them to, visit their doctor, take their children to school, and it's hugely expensive for them. Some boroughs, I think, cover that cost and some don't. Caroline, I'm going to bring you in now, and this is going to be the last group of questions, Good Work Standard and elsewhere.
Yes, and it's been great to hear the Good Work Standard mentioned so much during this morning, because we've actually found it quite difficult to get a fix on exactly what the Good Work Standard is. It was first going to be launched in 2018, and then it got delayed to 2019, and then it got pushed to spring 2019, and we're still waiting for the sort of actual launch, but it is meant to cover fair pay and contracts, workplace well-being, skills and development, and diversity and recruitment. So a lot of the things that we've been discussing this morning. So potentially could be very, very useful. So Sam, how powerful do you think the Good Work Standard is going to be when it surfaces?
A crystal ball to go. So the proof will be in what develops over the next year or two. I say we've engaged with a team who've been drafting it, as have kind of lots of our unions, so GMB colleagues, Unison, Unite, and others. And I say we've been talking to the team from the beginning. I think there are some issues with it. We would have liked to have seen it go further on some of the issues around kind of access and the role of unions, although that is in there under the what good looks like. But there are some things which are incredibly important. So just on the baseline stuff, which covers the kind of statutory things which employers should do, but that does have stuff like a day one statement of your terms and conditions. So things that would seem like common sense to all of us, but actually aren't kind of there. But to sign up to it, that should be there. But there are issues which are going to be worked out in practice. So the commitment is that it should extend to the supply chain, the immediate kind of supply chains and contracted out workers of companies who sign up to it. That's going to be very difficult to do, I think, and I'm not quite sure that the team who are working on it kind of quite have understood fully how difficult that's going to be to kind of actually kind of implement and stuff. Although they are working with us and other colleagues who've got lots of experience on this. So it potentially could be extremely good for bringing people together, for getting people signed up. They had the soft launch, didn't they, as you said, just back end of last year. And I think I'm right in saying there are about 50 companies arrayed.
45. They're called champions.
Assigning up to it, including a number of our unions in London as well. So we have. Sorry, this is a long-winded way of saying we have hope. It's going to be a positive step. It encapsulates, as you said, those 4 areas, all of which are very important. And it's a good way of joining it up. But it's really going to depend on how it's rolled out and who signs up. And I think our biggest point, from a union point of view, or certainly a TC point of view, was there is only so far you can go with working with good employers is important. So the employers who want to go on that journey and do the right thing, it comes back to Susan's point around people who kind of want to engage but it's difficult and they've got issues but want to talk and find out, and we absolutely have to engage with those. But we also have to be honest around kind of business models and business practices which are predicated on driving down terms and conditions of exactly the sort of people that Helen is working directly with at the moment. And those companies are not going to be signing up for the Good Work Standard anytime soon. So we've got to look at how we do both, how we use the kind of examples of companies who are taking the journey of a Good Work Standard to encourage the ones who are trying to pull down terms and conditions. And that's going to be kind of a very important role about political judgment and how far the Mayor, supported hopefully by the Assembly, prepared to go in kind of supporting the good and calling out the bad. So said that's a long-winded way of saying we just don't know yet, but we have hope for it.
Yes, okay, that's very much, I think, probably the view that the committee has been forming over the last year as we've been asking questions about it. Does anyone here know any Good Work champion on the scheme?
Yes, a number of them are living wage accredited employers, which is, I think, really helpful. We've worked closely with the Mayor's team on the Good Work Standard as well. I think my understanding is that it will officially launch later this month, so we'll be able to see who the 45 are then. But I think what's going to be helpful is a resource available to businesses to try and make some of those changes. So trying to give employers some of the how. I know that the conversations I have aren't, we think it's a good idea that paying better wages and being good employers is a good idea, but how do we do it? So a body that is providing the how is a really helpful space, I think.
And do you think the Good Work Standard will provide the how? Do you think the Mayor's teams will provide some of that how, or do you
From
think
my
that's going to need
understanding,
to come from...
there is some of that available, and signposting to others who do that well is helpful as well. Also, we hope it's a positive thing. We think it will be, but we'll have to wait and see.
We've touched on procurement sort of through the meeting, and we've also heard about the kind of ripple effect through procurement from living wage accredited employers. Does anyone have anything they want to say on how effectively the Mayor is using procurement in terms of helping the whole agenda of good work? Sam?
Definitely think there's more that could be done to support the role of, as I said, access and supporting workers to actually organise for themselves. So, as I said, we're meeting hopefully quite shortly with kind of colleagues responsible for that here to look at policy as it is and what more we could do. As I said, we're looking at examples from London boroughs where they've probably started to go slightly further, and examples of other metropolitan kind of areas and Wales. So Wales, yes, it's a different devolution deal. We have more power, but they're just about to, not just about to, but they're in the process of discussions on a social partnership act which would cover public sector stuff but would also go over as much as they can into private sector and procurement, which has got lots of stuff around working with unions going forward as being a kind of good part of that. Manchester and Liverpool are looking at kind of their versions of Good Work Standards, so employment kind of stuff again, which have got procurement aspects, and we're talking to our colleagues in the TUC regions who cover those areas as well. So we think there's probably more that could be done on the use of procurement by City Hall, kind of across the GLA family, to encourage it. We're not saying stuff hasn't been done, but we just think there is more that could happen, and we would like to see the kind of Mayor pushing the envelope a bit more on that in kind of proactive stuff around engagement with, as I said, particularly from our point of view, with
so it's engagement with workers. Is there anything else that you'd like to see more proactive?
Well, I mean, and said not doesn't come under the low pay stuff, but then obviously there's loads of other issues which we have direct concern with on procurement in terms of kind of environmental, green, kind of lots of stuff like that, which would come into it, but probably isn't this meeting. So we know there are lots of things that we can use procurement for. Part of which is about how to improve terms and conditions, including pay, but it does go further than that. There'd also be stuff under that, obviously, on kind of where stuff is manufactured, where stuff is sourced, keeping jobs closer to home and stuff, which we'd like to work further on. So there's kind of other areas which are linked but outside of the remit of this particular discussion.
Thank you. Amy?
So I think the Good Work Standard and helping employers to achieve high standards in employment should be something that is pushed through the procurement space for the GLA. One of the bits of work that we've been doing over the last 18 months is looking at tackling underemployment and insecurity for hours. We know that's not, pay isn't the only solution to in-work poverty. And in June we're looking to launch a new set of measures that do exactly that. A broad coalition of workers, employers and unions have come together to look at what good practice might look like in terms of contracts. So if you are offering we're calling it living hours contract, what you do, what the minimum amount of hours a week you need to offer, how a 4-week notice period for shift patterns, for example, and a contract that accurately represents your hours. I think there are some key measures there for low-paid workers in particular, where the insecurity and the risk is on them, not and it could be shared between both the employer and the employee. I think we would like to see, when that's launched, the Mayor pushing that out through his procurement space as well. We know that is going to have an impact and a positive benefit for workers in particular.
Fantastic, thank you.
I should just say, all forward, you've not seen it, but with Great Jobs Agenda, which is for TUC's kind of 6 things which constitute what a really decent job looks like. There's 6 categories: voice at work, pay, hours, which obviously covers this bit, health and safety in the workplace, learning and progression, and I've just forgotten one. Anyway, but the 6. But the 6 kind of key areas.
You'll send them to us.
Which we would want to see procurement backing up. And as Amy says, each of those areas we think there are bits where the Mayor's procurement policy could, or GLA's procurement policy could support all of those 6 areas.
Yes, fantastic. Lynnie, would you like to take the last bullet point, since you're the chair? And
Well, I mean, I think we've just been touching on any other suggestions for things that the Mayor could do to help tackle low pay and in-work poverty, but if there's anything that anybody feels that they have not yet added in to the discussion, I'm going to start with Sam. Have you managed to cover?
I think I've probably covered quite a lot. As I said, procurement, making great works, and then the supportive statements and the kind of positive stuff on the actual role of unionisation and organising workers as being the absolute key determinant in sustainably supporting people going forwards.
Manny, is there anything you wanted to add? Amy?
I think the final thing for me is the outsource piece that's sort of come up a few times. It's so important to be working with those companies and those companies that are procuring to other organisations, involving them in a conversation. I think will be a move towards trying to fix some of the problems that are coming out through outsourcing. I mean, we have a recognised service provider scheme where the responsibility really is on the employer who is procuring that service to request a living wage service. And actually, if we're working with both sides, I think we can eradicate some of this low pay a bit.
If you're outsourcing, someone must have written a document and should write into it certain of the things that should be in the contract for the people.
And that's the easiest way, I think, to make living wage or whatever else you want to write into that happen.
Thank you. Tim, was there anything last thing you wanted to add?
The only thing, just to reiterate, just the volatility of income, for the Mayor to be aware of the impacts that has, and that, for example, the interaction with the universal credit system can sometimes exacerbate that volatility. For example, workers might get lots of hours at Christmas time and not in November, say, so the universal credit top-up is sort of quite high at Christmas because they haven't done any hours in November. But they also get lots of hours at Christmas, so they earn lots of money. And then in January, their hours are cut back by employers, and universal credits cut back because they earned so much the previous month. And because it's a monthly thing, then it's not really reflecting their true earnings in any particular month, and it's sort of a month lagged, and that can really have exacerbate lots of issues for seasonal workers. And it's just. That was just an example, but I mean, other workers where you have consistent hours through time, then that's less of a problem. But it's those
that's a very well made point. Helen, was there anything you just wanted to add at the end?
I mean, our experience is that outsourcing doesn't work because it leads to a driving down of workers' pay terms and conditions, and also it leads to a lesser service as well, which is a separate point. What we want to see is workers being paid wages that they can live on. We want to see sick pay from day one. We want to see proper contracts, people's hours and job titles, etc. on them, which isn't happening at the moment. And we want to see health and safety standards being upheld because there's breaches all over the place. And where those things aren't happening, we want to see enforcement and we want to see penalties and sanctions.
Thank you. And I think probably everybody around the table will be quite keen to see something that stops encouraging people who are ill to go into places of employment and share their illnesses with people, because and particularly in a hospital environment, that's so inappropriate. I'd like to thank all of our guests very much for all of your contributions today. Sam, Manny, Amy, Tim and Helen. We've had a lot of data, we've had a lot of information, and actually I must say, Helen, thank you very much for coming, because I think your particular contributions have really illuminated from the worker perspective some very difficult working conditions, both on the low pay and the in-work poverty side. So thank you all. I think that's been a very rounded discussion. Could I ask the committee to note the discussion, and could you delegate authority to me in consultation with the party group leads to agree any appropriate outputs from today's meeting? And we'll note the report that was prepared by the scrutiny team as background to the discussion with the invited guests. And I will hopefully not forget to do anything. Could we also note the remainder of our meeting dates, which have now been set on the 2nd of May at the Assembly AGM, and also note the topic for the next meeting on the 18th of June, which will continue our investigation into low-paid work and in-work poverty. And as I just said, the date of the next meeting to note is the 18th of June, and that's going to be in the Chamber. There's no other business that I consider urgent, but I would just like to thank Pauline for her support to the committee. This is going to be her last meeting with us, as she's going on to, hopefully we're not going to say greater things, but other things. So thank you very much for your support, Pauline, and thank you very much everyone for coming today.
GLA